Before the flood swept the earth clean, there was a time when the boundaries between heaven and earth grew thin, when angels walked among men, when knowledge forbidden to mortals passed through trembling hands, when the sky itself watched in silence as creation bent beneath the weight of rebellion. The Book of Watchers remembers what the world has tried to forget. It speaks of the Watchers, celestial beings appointed to observe, never to interfere. Yet they descended. They chose flesh over spirit. They taught secrets meant to remain hidden until the appointed time. And from their union with the daughters of men came the Nephilim, giants who filled the earth with violence and corruption. This is not merely a story of fallen angels. It is the account of how the divine order shattered, how knowledge became a weapon, how immortal beings, created to serve the eternal light, became architects of ruin. The Book of Watchers was preserved when other texts were lost, hidden in caves, copied by ancient hands, guarded through centuries of silence. Why? What truth does it carry that could not be allowed to vanish? It names the angels who fell. It records their forbidden teachings. It reveals the prayers of the righteous and the cries of a defiled earth. It shows the moment when heaven looked down and decreed judgment, not only upon the Watchers, but upon all that they had corrupted. Yet within its lines there is also mercy, the promise that even in the deepest rebellion, the divine does not abandon creation. That judgment is not the end, but the clearing of ground for something new to grow. Tonight we will walk through this ancient text slowly. We will hear the names of those who fell. We will witness the unraveling of the world before the flood. We will listen to the warnings given, the boundaries crossed, and the consequences that followed. And we will understand why this book, hidden for so long, was never meant to be forgotten. Before rebellion there was order. The heavens held countless beings, each with purpose, each with station. The throne of the Most High stood at the center of all things, radiant and eternal. Around it moved hierarchies of light, angels and archangels, seraphim and cherubim, principalities and powers. Each had their place. Each had their duty. Among them were the Watchers. They were not the highest of heaven's host. They did not stand closest to the throne, but their task was sacred nonetheless. They were celestial sentinels, guardians appointed to observe, to watch, to witness, to alert the heavenly council of all that unfolded across creation. Their name itself carried their function. Watchers, the wakeful ones, eyes that never closed, minds that never wandered, spirits that remained vigilant, always turned toward the earth below and the throne above. They were not meant to intervene. Their task was witness, not participation. They stood at the boundary between heaven and earth, seeing both, touching neither. They observed the turning of the world, the rising of the sun, the shifting of the seasons, the movements of wind and water. They watched as creation continued its slow unfolding, exactly as it had been designed. And they watched humanity. The first generations of Adam multiplied across the earth. From Eden's eastern gate, the children of exile spread into valleys and plains. They built shelters. They planted gardens. They raised livestock and learned the rhythms of soil and harvest. Cities began to rise, small at first, clusters of stone and timber, places where families gathered and stories were told beneath the stars. The Watchers saw it all. They beheld the beauty of creation in its infancy, untouched yet by the corruption that would come. The earth was young. Humanity was learning. There was struggle, yes, thorns and thistles, the sweat of labor, the pain of childbirth, but there was also wonder. Children laughed. Lovers embraced. Elders passed wisdom to the young. The image of the divine, though fractured by the fall, still flickered in the hearts of men and women. The Watchers observed this with something approaching reverence. They had been present at creation's dawn. They had heard the voice that spoke light into being. They had seen the waters part, the land emerge, the first breath enter Adam's lungs. And now they watched as that same creative power continued to work, slower, quieter, through generation after generation of mortal lives. Their names were written in the heavenly councils: Semjaza, Azazel, Armaros, Barakal, Kakabel, Tamiel, Asradel. Each name carried weight in the courts of heaven. Each was known. Each was trusted with the sacred task of vigilance. Their faces turned always toward the throne of the Most High. Even as their eyes observed the earth, their hearts remained fixed on the eternal light. They did not question their assignment. They did not grow weary of watching. To serve was their joy. To obey was their nature. Heaven itself was order, structure, harmony. Every being knew their place. Every voice joined the endless song of worship that rose like incense before the throne. The watchers were part of that song. They added their voices to the chorus, calm, steady, faithful. But in their watching, something stirred. It began small, a flicker, a thought that lingered longer than it should. They had been observing humanity for generations now. They had seen the daughters of men grow in number and in beauty. They had watched the way light caught in their hair, the way their voices rose in song, the grace with which they moved through fields and markets. The watchers were not human. They did not possess flesh. They had never known desire in the way mortals understood it, but something within them began to shift, a longing, a pull toward what they witnessed, an ache that grew slowly, imperceptibly, like water wearing away stone. They were beings of light, yet they found themselves drawn to shadow, not the darkness of evil, not yet, but the shadowed places of the earth where humanity dwelled, the caves where families gathered at night, the clearings where women danced under the moon, the riverbanks where voices echoed in laughter and song. The watchers had been created to observe without attachment, to witness without longing, but the boundary between observation and desire is thinner than heaven had anticipated. They watched, and in watching, they began to want. At first, they did not name what they felt. Perhaps they did not have words for it. Angels do not experience time as mortals do. A century might pass in what feels like a moment. But even for them, there came a point when the longing could no longer be ignored, when the watching became not enough. Semjaza was the first to speak it aloud. Among the watchers, he held a place of leadership. His voice carried weight in their councils, and one day, in the presence of his brothers, he named the desire that had been growing in all of them. He spoke of the daughters of men, of their beauty, of the way they reflected something of the divine image, even in their mortality. He spoke of the distance that separated heaven from earth, and how unbearable that distance had become. The other watchers listened, and they understood, because they had felt it too. Azazel, Armaros, Barakal, each had experienced the same pull, the same ache. They had tried to ignore it, to focus on their duty, to keep their faces turned toward the throne, but the desire would not fade. What began as individual longing became collective intent. The watchers gathered. They spoke in hushed tones, even though heaven could hear all things. They discussed what had once been unthinkable, leaving their posts, descending, taking physical form, entering the world they had only observed from above. They knew it was forbidden. The boundaries between heaven and earth were not accidental. They had been established by divine wisdom, set in place for reasons the watchers did not fully understand but had always accepted. Angels belonged to heaven. Humans belonged to earth. The two were not meant to merge. But desire has a way of rewriting what the heart believes to be true. The watchers began to justify what they wanted. They told themselves they could help humanity. They could teach. They could guide. They possessed knowledge that mortals lacked, secrets of the stars, the movements of celestial bodies, the hidden properties of plants and metals. Surely such knowledge could benefit the world below. It was a lie, of course, a half-truth that masked the real motive. They did not want to descend as teachers. They wanted to descend as lovers, as beings who could touch, taste, experience the flesh they had only witnessed from afar. Still, they hesitated. The cost of such rebellion was unknown, but it was certainly great. To abandon their heavenly posts meant abandoning their place in the eternal order. It meant turning away from the throne. It meant choosing the temporary over the eternal, the mortal over the immortal. Semjaza understood the weight of what he was proposing. He knew that if he led this rebellion, he would bear the greatest burden of guilt. So he made a demand of the others. If they were to do this, they would do it together. They would swear an oath, binding themselves to one another and to the choice they were about to make. 200 watchers gathered. They stood together in a place between heaven and earth, a threshold where the light of the throne grew dim. And there they swore. They bound themselves with curses and oaths, each promising not to turn back, not to abandon the plan, not to leave any one of them to bear the consequences alone. The oath was spoken, the decision was made. The watchers who had been created to guard the sacred order chose to break it, not in ignorance, not by accident, but deliberately, with full knowledge that they were crossing a line that could never be uncrossed. Heaven did not stop them, the Most High did not. Strike them down in that moment. Free will, even among angels, was sacred. The choice was theirs to make, and they made it. The purity they had once embodied began to crack. The light that had always defined them grew dim. They were still watchers, but they were no longer watchers only. They had become something else, something creation had never seen before. Rebels. The moment the oath was sealed, something shifted in the heavens. It was not visible, not audible, but it was felt. A tremor in the fabric of creation. A ripple that moved outward from the place where the watchers stood, bound now by their own words, their own choice. They had always been beings of light, but light can be bent. Light can be redirected, and in choosing the earth over eternity, they bent themselves away from the source that had given them form and purpose. The throne of the Most High remained. The eternal song continued. The seraphim still cried holy. The cherubim still guarded the sacred mysteries, but among the watchers there was silence now, not the peaceful silence of contemplation, but the hollow silence of absence. They had removed themselves from the harmony. They had stepped outside the order. And they felt it. For the first time, they experienced something like fear, not the reverent awe they had always known in the presence of the divine, but a cold, creeping dread. The knowledge that they had done something irrevocable, that the path ahead could not be undone. Still, they pressed forward. Desire, once given permission, does not hesitate. It moves with terrible momentum. The watchers who had sworn the oath began their preparations. They would need to take physical form. They would need to enter the realm of flesh and bone, of breath and blood. This was not natural to them. Angels were not made for bodies, but they had witnessed enough of creation to understand how it worked. They had seen the union of spirit and matter in humanity, and they would mimic it. Mount Hermon became the place of descent, a mountain on the borders of the known world where the heavens seemed to touch the earth, where the air grew thin and the stars hung low. It was a threshold, a boundary, and it was there that the watchers would cross over. One by one they came down. The first to touch the earth felt the weight of it immediately. Gravity, limitation, the pull of the ground beneath what were now feet. Bodies formed around them, strong, radiant, beautiful, but bound by the laws of the world they had entered. They could no longer move at the speed of thought. They could no longer exist in multiple places at once. They were here, only here, fixed in time and space. It was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure. The 200 watchers stood together on the slopes of Hermon, newly clothed in flesh, breathing air for the first time. They looked at one another with eyes that now required light to see. They spoke with voices that now required sound to be heard. Everything had changed. And yet the longing that had brought them here remained, stronger now, more urgent. They had sacrificed everything to satisfy this desire, and they would not turn back. They descended further, leaving the mountain behind, moving into the valleys where humanity lived. They walked among the cities and villages, towering and glorious, impossible to ignore. The people saw them and were afraid. These were not ordinary men. Their presence carried echoes of the divine, even in their rebellion. They moved with a grace that did not belong to the earth. They spoke with authority that mortals could not challenge. The daughters of men whom the watchers had observed from heaven now stood before them, close enough to touch, close enough to claim. But before the unions, before the consequences, before the world began its long slide toward ruin, there was this moment. The watchers, standing on the earth they had only ever watched from above, no longer guardians, no longer sentinels, no longer faithful. They had been created for devotion. They had been given the sacred task of witness. They had been trusted with vigilance, with the slow and patient work of observing creation as it unfolded according to divine design, and they had abandoned it all. Not for truth, not for righteousness, not for some higher calling, but for desire, for the ache to possess what they had only been meant to see. This was the fracture, the break in heaven's perfect order, the moment when beings who had never known rebellion chose it anyway. When angels who had stood in the presence of the eternal light turned their faces away and walked into shadow. The earth would bear the scars of this choice. Humanity would suffer under the weight of it. The Nephilim would rise, violence would fill the land, and the flood would come. But that was still ahead. For now there was only this. The watchers, no longer watching, standing on ground they were never meant to touch, clothed in flesh they were never meant to, where, driven by desire, they were never meant to feel. The sacred order had been broken, and nothing would ever be the same. As humanity spread across the earth, something unprecedented occurred. The sons and daughters of Adam multiplied. They moved into new lands, built new settlements, filled valleys and plains with the sounds of life. Generation after generation, the earth grew more populated, and with each generation something changed. The daughters of men grew in number and in beauty. It was not merely physical appearance, though that was part of it. There was something more, a radiance, a grace, a reflection of the divine image that had been breathed into humanity at the beginning. Even in their mortality, even after the fall, they carried traces of the glory they had been made to bear. Their voices rose in song, in the fields during harvest, in the homes during evening meals, in the courtyards during festivals. The melodies were simple, passed from mother to daughter, from elder to child. But there was beauty in that simplicity, a longing, a hope that refused to die even in a world marked by thorns and labor. Their laughter echoed through valleys, children playing by streams, sisters sharing secrets beneath olive trees, friends walking together through markets where merchants called out their wares. The sound was light, unburdened, carrying on the wind like something sacred. Their grace reflected something of the divine image in which they were crafted. The way they moved, the way they cared for their families, the way they carried water from the well, ground grain for bread, wove cloth on simple looms. There was dignity in their work, strength in their softness, a beauty that went deeper than the eye could see. And the watchers from their stations above began to notice. At first it was innocent, part of their duty. They observed humanity as they had always done, watching the slow progress of civilization, the rise and fall of communities, the rhythms of birth and death. But something shifted. The observation became something else. Not as distant observers, but with longing. It began subtly, a moment where the gaze lingered too long, a thought that returned unbidden, a stirring that had no name, no precedent. The watchers had never experienced desire. They were beings of pure spirit, created for service, for worship, for the execution of divine purpose. But now, watching the daughters of men, something awakened in them that should have remained dormant. The boundary between observation and obsession is thinner than it appears. What starts as notice becomes fascination. Fascination becomes fixation, and fixation becomes hunger. The Book of Watchers records this moment with stark simplicity. The angels saw, and they wanted. There was no gradual blurring of lines, no slow drift into confusion. It was immediate and absolute. They saw the daughters of men, that they were fair, and desire seized them. Not the pure appreciation of beauty that reflects back to the Creator, not the joy of witnessing creation flourish, but something darker, something possessive, with desire that blurred the boundary between heaven and earth. The watchers had been stationed at that boundary for ages. They stood between the eternal and the temporal, the immortal and the mortal, the divine and the human. Their task was to maintain that distinction, to observe without crossing, to witness without entering. But desire does not respect boundaries. It erodes them. It whispers that what is forbidden might not be wrong, that what is separate might be meant to join. What began as observation became obsession. The watchers could no longer focus on their duties. They could no longer turn their attention fully to the throne. Their eyes were drawn constantly downward, toward the earth, toward the women who moved through their days unaware of the gaze fixed upon them from above. The sacred distance between immortal and mortal began to collapse, not physically, not yet, but in the hearts and minds of the watchers the gulf was already narrowing. They began to imagine what it would be like to descend, to take form, to touch, to possess. Among the watchers, whispers began, quiet at first, spoken only in the hidden corners of heaven where the light from the throne grew dim. They spoke of what they had seen, of the daughters of men, of the longing that had taken root in each of them. Semjaza heard these whispers. He was not the highest among the watchers, but he carried influence. Others looked to him, listened when he spoke, trusted his judgment, and he, more than any other, felt the weight of the desire that was spreading through their ranks like fire through dry grass. He could have silenced it. He could have called the watchers back to their duty, reminded them of their purpose, turned their faces once more toward the throne. But he did not, because he felt it too, the pull, the ache, the unbearable distance between what he wanted and where he stood. So instead of resisting, Semjaza gave voice to what the others had only dared to think. He gathered them in. Not all at once, but slowly, carefully. One conversation led to another. One watcher confided in his brother who confided in another. The circle grew. Azazel joined. Then Armaros, Barakal, Kakabel, Tamiel, Asradal, names that had once been spoken with reverence in the courts of heaven now became the names of conspirators. They met in secret, though nothing in heaven is truly hidden. They spoke in hushed tones, though all speech ultimately reaches the throne. Perhaps they believed they could conceal their intentions, or perhaps they no longer cared. Semjaza laid out the plan. They would descend. They would take physical form. They would choose wives from among the daughters of men and know them as husbands know wives. They would cross the boundary that separated heaven from earth, immortal from mortal, spirit from flesh. The other watchers listened, and they did not object, because this was what they wanted, what they had been wanting since the desire first stirred: permission, solidarity, a path forward. But there was fear too. Descending meant abandoning their posts, leaving their stations, turning away from the eternal light they had always served. The consequences were unknown, but certainly severe. To rebel against the divine order was to invite judgment, and judgment from the Most High was not something to be taken lightly. Semjaza understood this fear. He felt it himself. The weight of what he was proposing pressed down on him like a stone. If he led this rebellion, if he convinced these angels to follow him into transgression, the guilt would be his to bear. The others might blame him when the reckoning came. They might claim they were deceived, that they followed him in ignorance, that the fault was his alone. So he made a demand. If they were to do this, they would do it together. No one would be able to claim innocence. No one would escape the consequences by pretending they had been led astray. They would all be equally guilty, equally bound. They would swear an oath. 200 watchers agreed. They gathered on Mount Hermon, a place where the earth reached toward heaven, where the boundary between the two realms felt thin. The name itself would become a testimony, Hermon, from the root word meaning oath or curse, a mountain that would forever mark the place where angels chose rebellion. They stood together, these 200, and they swore. They bound themselves with curses, each one promising not to turn back, not to abandon the plan, not to leave any among them to bear the guilt alone. The oath was not spoken lightly. It carried weight, power. Once spoken, it could not be unspoken. Once sworn, it could not be unsworn. Semjaza led the oath, but every voice joined in. Every watcher present became equally culpable. They knew what they were doing. They understood the magnitude of their choice. This was not ignorance. This was not accident. This was deliberate, knowing, willful rebellion. The oath bound them to one another and to the choice they were making. There would be no turning back, no second thoughts, no last-minute repentance. They had chosen the daughters of men over the courts of heaven. They had chosen desire over duty. They had chosen the temporary over the eternal. Heaven did not strike them down in that moment. The earth did not open to swallow them. The Most High remained silent, allowing them the terrible freedom to choose, because even angels, it seemed, were granted the dignity of choice. Even beings of light could turn toward darkness if they willed it. And they willed it. The oath was sealed. The pact was made. The 200 watchers stood on Mount Hermon, bound now by their own words, their own desire, their own rebellion. They looked at one another and they saw reflection, not of light but of longing, not of holiness but of hunger. Below them, in the valleys and plains, the daughters of men continued their lives, unaware that heaven's gaze had turned predatory, unaware that immortal beings had chosen them as objects of desire, unaware that the world was about to change in ways that could never be undone. The moment the oath was complete, something irreversible occurred. The watchers felt it immediately, a severance, a cutting away. They were still angelic beings, still possessed of power and knowledge beyond mortal comprehension, but they were no longer fully part of heaven's order. They had removed themselves, excommunicated themselves through their own choice. The light that had always surrounded them grew dimmer, not extinguished but muted, tarnished, like silver that has begun to corrode. They were still radiant compared to anything on earth, but compared to what they had been, they were already falling. And still the desire remained, stronger now, more urgent. They had sacrificed everything to pursue it. There could be no hesitation, no doubt. To doubt now would mean acknowledging that they had made a terrible mistake, so they pressed forward, convinced themselves that what they wanted must be right, must be justified, must be worth the cost. The descent began. One by one, then in groups, the watchers left their stations. They moved downward, away from the heavenly courts, away from the throne, away from the light that had defined their existence since the moment of their creation. They passed through the firmament, through the layers of sky, through clouds and wind, until they reached the solid ground of Mount Hermon. They had to take physical form. Angels do not naturally possess bodies. They are spirit, thought, light given will and consciousness. But to interact with the physical world, to touch and be touched, they needed flesh. They needed bones and blood, nerves and sinew. They needed to become something they had never been. The transformation was both exhilarating and horrifying. To be bound by a body, to feel weight and limitation, to know hunger, thirst, fatigue. These were sensations they had only observed in humanity. Now they experienced them firsthand, and it was intoxicating. They stood on the slopes of Hermon, newly embodied, breathing air that filled lungs they had just acquired. They looked at one another with eyes that now required light to see. They were beautiful, these fallen watchers, tall and strong, radiant with residual glory, impossible to mistake for ordinary men. But they were no longer what they had been. They were something new, something hybrid, something that should not exist. Semjaza looked out over the lands below, where the daughters of men lived their lives in villages and cities scattered across the valleys. This was what they had come for. This was the prize they had abandoned heaven to claim. The watchers descended further, leaving the mountain behind. They walked into human settlements, and their arrival caused immediate disruption. People saw them and were afraid. They fell on their faces. They called them gods, lords, mighty ones. The watchers did not correct them. Perhaps they enjoyed the worship. Perhaps they felt it was their due. Or perhaps they simply did not care what mortals thought, as long as they got what they wanted. They sought out the daughters of men, the ones they had watched from above, the ones whose beauty had ignited this terrible longing. And now, standing before them in flesh, the watchers made their intentions clear. They would take wives. Not through courtship, not through the patient rituals that human men observed. The watchers simply chose. They saw women they desired and they claimed them. Some women may have been flattered by the attention of these glorious beings. Some may have been terrified. Some may have had no choice at all. The text does not linger on the consent or resistance of the daughters of men. It records only the fact: the watchers took wives, multiple wives. They entered into unions that violated the order of creation, joining immortal with mortal, spirit with flesh, heaven with earth in a way that was never intended. The cosmic law was broken. The boundary that had been established at creation, the separation between angelic and human, was shattered, and creation itself trembled under the weight of what had been done. This was the catalyst. This was the moment that set everything else in motion. The Nephilim would be born from these unions. Violence would spread. Forbidden knowledge would be taught. The earth would become so corrupt that the only solution would be total cleansing. The flood would come. Judgment would fall. But all of that began here, with beauty that moved heaven, with angels who mistook desire for love, with a choice to possess rather than protect, to take rather than guard, to corrupt rather than serve. The daughters of men, whose grace had reflected the divine image, became instruments of heaven's fall, not because they did anything wrong, not because they were evil or seductive in any deliberate way, simply because they existed, simply because they were beautiful, and that beauty, observed by beings who should have remained observers only, became the spark that ignited rebellion. The watchers stood on the earth now, clothed in flesh, bound to the women they had chosen. They had gotten what they wanted. They had crossed the boundary. They had satisfied their desire. But satisfaction would not last. Desire never does. And the consequences of their choice were already beginning to unfold, spreading outward like ripples from a stone thrown into still water. The world would never be the same. Heaven would never forget. And the daughters of men, whose only crime was being lovely, would bear children who would become monsters. The oath on Mount Hermon was complete. The descent was finished. The rebellion was fully realized. And there was no going back. They came down. The watchers left their celestial posts and entered the realm of flesh. The descent was not gradual. It was decisive, irreversible. There was no slow transition, no gentle easing from one state to another. One moment they stood in the courts of heaven, bound by oath and desire. The next, they were falling. Mount Hermon became the threshold between two worlds. It rose from the earth like a finger pointing toward the sky, snow-capped and ancient, marking the northern boundary of the lands where humanity dwelled. The mountain had witnessed much: the turning of seasons, the migration of peoples, the slow march of time. But it had never witnessed anything like this. The angels came down upon its slopes, 200 of them descending as one. If any mortal had been watching that night, they would have seen something impossible. Lights falling from the heavens. Not like stars burning out, but like stars choosing to land. Radiance pouring down through the darkness, gathering at the summit of Hermon, converging at the place where they had sworn their oath. There the angels took physical form. It was not natural for them. Angels are spirit, thought, and will made conscious, light-given purpose. They do not possess bodies in the way humans do, but the Watchers had been given unique abilities. Among all the heavenly host, they alone could assume flesh at will. It was a gift, meant perhaps to allow them to interact with the physical world when divine purposes required it. But like all gifts, it could be misused. And they misused it. The transformation was both wondrous and terrible. Spirit compressed into matter. Light solidified into bone and sinew. The infinite reduced to the finite. Each Watcher felt the sudden weight of embodiment, the pull of gravity, the need for breath, the boundaries of skin containing what had once been boundless. They stood on Mount Hermon in bodies that gleamed with residual glory, tall beyond human measure, strong beyond mortal capacity, beautiful in a way that hurt to look upon, like staring too long at the sun. They were neither fully angel nor fully human, but something in between, something hybrid, something wrong. There they bound themselves to the earth through oath and action. The oath had already been spoken, but now it was sealed through their very presence. They had left heaven. They had taken form. They had crossed the boundary that was never meant to be crossed. There could be no return, no undoing, no pretending this had not happened. The mountain itself seemed to shudder beneath their feet, as if the earth recognized what had just occurred, as if creation understood that something fundamental had been violated. The Watchers had brought heaven down to earth, but not in the way it was ever meant to descend. Not as blessing, not as visitation, but as invasion. They looked out over the valleys below, where human cities glimmered with the light of evening fires, where the daughters of men moved through their routines, unaware that immortal beings now stood above them, gazing down with desire that had consumed every other consideration. Semjaza, who had led the oath, now led the descent. He stepped forward and the others followed. They moved down the slopes of Hermon, leaving the heights behind, entering the lowlands where humanity lived. With each step, they committed more fully to the choice they had made. With each step, the distance between what they had been and what they were becoming grew wider. The Watchers were no longer observers. They were participants, actors in the drama rather than witnesses to it, and the role they had chosen to play would bring nothing but ruin. They entered the cities and villages like gods descending among mortals, and in a sense that is what they were. Beings of heaven, clothed in flesh, walking streets meant only for human feet. Their presence was overwhelming. People saw them and fell silent. Children hid behind their mothers. Men stepped back, hands raised in gestures of reverence or fear. The Watchers towered over ordinary humans. Their voices carried weight that had nothing to do with volume. When they spoke, people listened not because they wanted to, but because they could not do otherwise. There was authority in every word, power in every glance. The residue of their celestial origin clung to them like a scent that could not be washed away. They chose wives from among the daughters of men, not through force alone, but through seduction, through the weight of their presence, through knowledge and power that mortals could not resist. Some women were drawn to them willingly, dazzled by their beauty, intoxicated by their attention. How could a mortal man compare to a being who had stood in the courts of heaven? How could an ordinary life satisfy after an angel had spoken promises of secrets and wonders? Other women had no choice. The Watchers took what they wanted. They were stronger than any human, wiser in the ways of manipulation. They could offer gifts, knowledge, protection, status that desperate families could not refuse. They could make threats without speaking them aloud. The mere fact of their existence was threat enough. The unions were consummated. Angels who had never known physical desire now knew it fully. The daughters of men, whether willing or unwilling, became vessels for something creation had never intended. The boundary between heaven and earth was violated with each coupling, with each forbidden union. And creation itself groaned under the weight of what should never have been. The earth felt it, the ground beneath their feet, the air they breathed, the water that flowed through rivers and filled wells. All of it trembled with the wrongness of what was happening. Matter was not meant to join with spirit in this way, mortal with immortal, human with angelic. The mixing was unnatural and nature knew it. This was not love. It was transgression dressed in intimacy. The Watchers called their actions marriage, but there was no covenant here, no mutual submission, no sacred union before the Creator, only desire taking what it wanted and calling it righteous, only power asserting itself over weakness and calling it partnership. The Watchers brought their glory into the dust, and the dust could not hold it without corruption. Everything they touched began to change. The women they took as wives grew heavy with pregnancies that were unlike any before. Their bodies struggled to contain what grew within them. Children conceived through the union of angel and human were never meant to exist, and their very existence twisted the natural order. The women bore children, but these were not ordinary children. From the moment of birth, it was clear something was terribly wrong. The infants were too large, too strong. Their eyes held intelligence that should not yet be present. They grew at rates that defied explanation. What should have taken years took months. What should have taken decades took only years. These were the Nephilim, the fallen ones, the giants, offspring neither fully human nor fully divine. They inherited strength from their fathers, the power of celestial beings compressed into flesh. But they also inherited mortality from their mothers, the limitations, the hungers, the death that angels never knew. The combination was catastrophic. They were beings of immense strength and appetite. As children, they consumed more food than entire families. As they grew, their needs became insatiable. They ate until there was nothing left to eat. They demanded until there was nothing left to give. Their fathers watched with something like pride, seeing their own power reflected in these hybrid offspring. But they did not see what was coming. They did not understand that the Nephilim would become something even they could not control. The giants grew and violence grew with them. They did not know gentleness. They did not understand restraint. Their nature was corrupt from the beginning, twisted by the circumstances of their origin. They were creatures that should not exist, and their existence was marked by hunger, for food, for power, for dominance. The Nephilim soon filled the earth with violence. They were not content to remain with their mother's people. They spread outward, claiming territory, establishing dominion over regions that had once been peaceful. Wherever they went, terror followed. They did not ask for what they wanted. They took, and no mortal could stand against them. The earth began its slide toward the flood, not all at once, not in a single catastrophic moment, but gradually, inevitably, like a stone rolling down a hill, gathering speed with each turn. The presence of the Nephilim was the beginning. Their violence was the acceleration, and the corruption that spread from them would become the unstoppable momentum that led to total destruction. Humanity suffered. Ordinary men and women who had nothing to do with the Watchers' rebellion found themselves living in a world they no longer recognized. Cities that had been safe became dangerous. Fields that had produced food became battlegrounds. The strong preyed on the weak, and the Nephilim were stronger than anyone. Families were torn apart, children orphaned, women widowed. The blood of the innocent soaked into soil that could no longer absorb it. The cries of the oppressed rose toward heaven, but heaven seemed silent. The Watchers, who had once been guardians, had become the source of humanity's suffering, and they did not care. They were too consumed with their own desires, too intoxicated with the power they wielded on earth. They had everything they had wanted: physical form, human wives, offspring who carried their strength. They had satisfied their longing, but satisfaction brought no peace, only the need for more. The women who had borne the Nephilim suffered most of all. Their bodies had been used to bring monsters into the world. Our sons grew beyond their ability to control or guide. Some mothers watched in horror as their children became killers. Some died in childbirth, their bodies unable to survive the trauma of bearing creatures so much larger and stronger than human infants. Others lived, but with the knowledge that they had participated, willingly or not, in the corruption of creation. The moment when heaven's order crumbled was not dramatic. There was no lightning, no earthquakes, no voice from the sky announcing the collapse. It happened quietly, in bedrooms and birthing rooms, in the unions consummated and the children born. Each act of transgression was a crack in the foundation. Each Nephilim birth was another stone removed from the structure, and eventually the whole edifice came down. Heaven touched earth, and earth was burned by the contact. Like flesh pressed against fire, the meeting left scars that could not heal. The Watchers had believed they could bridge the gap between immortal and mortal. They had believed their desire was justification enough. They had believed they could violate the cosmic order without consequence. They were wrong. Creation was not designed to hold such unions. The human frame was not made to carry angelic seed. The earth was not meant to bear the weight of hybrid beings who belonged neither to heaven nor to earth. Everything groaned under the strain. The natural world began to break down. Animals behaved strangely. Plants grew twisted. Even the weather seemed to respond to the corruption, growing more violent, more unpredictable. The Nephilim continued to multiply. Each Watcher took multiple wives. Each union produced offspring. The giants spread across the known world, establishing themselves as rulers, warlords, tyrants. They built kingdoms on violence. They demanded worship from those weaker than themselves. They became legends, the mighty men of old, the men of renown, whose names would echo through history long after the flood had washed them away. But they were not heroes. They were abominations, living proof of what happens when boundaries meant to protect are destroyed, walking testimonies to the cost of desire unchecked by wisdom, monuments to rebellion built from flesh and bone instead of stone. The descent was complete. The Watchers had fully entered the realm of flesh. They had bound themselves to earth through wives and children. They had brought heaven down, but in doing so, they had defiled both heaven and earth. Neither realm could claim them now. They were exiles from one, corruptors of the other. Mount Hermon remained, silent witness to what had occurred on its slopes, the place where the oath was sworn, the place where angels became something less than angels and more than human, the place where the threshold between worlds was not merely crossed, but shattered. The world would never recover from this descent. The flood would come to cleanse what had been corrupted, but even after the waters receded, the memory would remain, written in texts like the Book of Watchers, preserved in the stories passed from generation to generation, a warning, a reminder, a testimony to what happens when heaven touches earth in ways it was never meant to. The Watchers had gotten what they wanted. They had descended. They had taken wives. They had produced offspring. But in gaining everything they desired, they had lost everything that mattered: their place in heaven, their purity, their purpose. And the world had lost its innocence. The age before the flood, when humanity had been learning to live in a fallen world, was over. Now came the age of violence, the age of giants, the age that could only end in water and judgment. The descent was finished, and there was no going back. The Watchers did not stop at union. They taught. They revealed. They gave humanity knowledge meant to remain hidden until the appointed time. The descent had been transgression enough, immortals taking mortal wives, producing offspring that violated the natural order. But the Watchers went further. They opened their mouths and spoke secrets. Secrets heaven never intended to share. Knowledge is not neutral. It carries weight, consequence, timing. What is harmless in one season becomes deadly in another. What benefits the mature destroys the unprepared. The Most High had established an order to revelation, truths to be learned in their time, wisdom to be gained through growth, understanding to unfold as creation matured. The Watchers shattered that order. Azazel was the first and perhaps the worst. Among all the fallen angels, his teachings brought the most immediate and visible destruction. He taught men to forge weapons, swords, knives, shields, breastplates, instruments of war that humanity had never conceived. Before Azazel's teaching, conflicts were settled with stones and wooden clubs. Violence existed. Cain had murdered Abel with whatever crude tool came to hand. But there was no craft to killing, no refinement of death. Azazel changed that. He showed them how to mine metals from the earth, how to recognize iron ore and copper deposits, how to extract them from rock, how to build furnaces hot enough to smelt and purify. These were mysteries of the earth, properties hidden in stone and soil, waiting for the proper time to be discovered. But the proper time had not come. Azazel revealed the art of working metals, how to heat them until they glowed, how to hammer them into shape, how to sharpen edges until they could slice through flesh and bone as easily as through air. He taught the difference between metals, which held an edge, which bent, which could be combined to create alloys stronger than either element alone. Men learned, and they crafted tools of destruction. The first sword was a revelation, light, balanced, deadly. It did not break like wood. It did not dull like stone. It was efficient, precise, beautiful in its terrible purpose. Warriors who held these new weapons became unstoppable. Armies equipped with metal suddenly dominated those who fought with older tools. Warfare changed overnight. What had been brutal and exhausting became swift and surgical. A man with a bronze sword could kill a dozen men armed only with clubs. Villages that had stood for generations fell in hours. The strong became stronger. The violent became more violent, and the earth filled with blood. But Azazel did not stop with weapons. He taught other things as well. He showed women how to beautify themselves, how to use antimony to darken the eyelids, how to apply rouge to the eyes, how to craft bracelets and ornaments, how to identify precious stones and work them into jewelry, how to use dyes and tinctures to enhance appearance. This might seem harmless compared to weapons, but it was not, because Azazel taught beautification for a purpose, seduction. Enhancement meant to attract, manipulate, control. Women learned to use their appearance as power. Men learned to desire what had been artificially enhanced. Lust grew more refined, more calculated, more consuming. Fornication increased. Marriages were abandoned for more beautiful partners. Faithfulness eroded. The simple unions that had sustained humanity gave way to pursuit of pleasure, of novelty, of possession. What God had designed to be sacred became sport. Semjaza, who had led the oath on Mount Hermon, also became a teacher. He taught enchantments and the cutting of roots. He revealed how certain plants held properties beyond nutrition, how roots, when harvested at specific times under specific conditions, could be used to affect the mind and body in ways that defied natural law. He taught potions and spells, how to mix substances to induce visions, how to prepare compounds that could sicken or heal depending on dosage and intent, how to whisper words over these mixtures that seemed to activate their power. This was the beginning of sorcery, the manipulation of natural forces through knowledge that was never meant to be separated from wisdom. Humanity learned, and they misused what they learned. Healers became poisoners. Those who could cure could also kill. Knowledge of roots became knowledge of assassination. Rival leaders fell suddenly ill. Enemies died with no visible wound. Fear spread as people realized death could come invisibly through a cup of wine or a bowl of stew. The enchantments Semjaza taught gave mortals power over one another in new and terrible ways. They learned to cloud minds, to induce false love, to create dependency and obsession. What should have been medicine became manipulation. What could have been healing became harm. Armaros taught the resolving of enchantments, the breaking of spells, countermagic to undo what Semjaza had taught. This might seem like balance, one teaching harm, another teaching protection. But it was not balance, it was escalation. Now there were spells and counterspells, enchantments and their reversals, a war of hidden knowledge where ordinary people became pawns in conflicts they could not see or understand. Barakul taught astrology. He revealed the signs of the stars, how the movements of celestial bodies corresponded to events on Earth, how patterns in the heavens could be read to predict the future, how the position of stars at a person's birth influenced their character and destiny. This was knowledge the Watchers possessed because they had observed creation from its beginning. They had seen the stars set in their courses. They understood the rhythms and cycles of the cosmos. But this understanding was meant to remain with heaven. Mortals were meant to live day by day, season by season, trusting in divine providence rather than trying to manipulate fate through celestial knowledge. Instead, humanity learned to read the stars, and they became obsessed with prediction, with control, with bending the future to their will. They made decisions not based on wisdom or righteousness, but on what the stars seemed to promise. They attributed power to planets and constellations that should have been attributed only to the Creator. Kakibel taught the signs of the stars, similar to Barakul but focused on omens, how to interpret unusual celestial events, comets, eclipses, conjunctions. Every streak of light across the night sky became a portent. Every alignment became a message. Humanity grew superstitious, fearful, controlled by the very heavens that were meant to declare divine glory. Tamil taught the observation of celestial bodies, the detailed study of planetary movements, the tracking of their courses, the mathematical prediction of where they would be in the future. This was astronomy twisted toward divination, science corrupted by the desire to control rather than simply understand. Asradal taught the course of the moon, its phases, its influence on tides and seasons, how it affected the growth of plants and the behavior of animals, and how it could be used to time rituals, to enhance the power of spells, to determine auspicious moments for various undertakings. Each angel brought a fragment of celestial wisdom and placed it in human hands, and each fragment, separated from the whole, became dangerous, like giving a child a sharp knife or a burning coal. The knowledge itself was not evil, but humanity was not ready. They lacked the maturity, the restraint, the wisdom to handle what they had been given. The result was not enlightenment, it was chaos. Humanity gained power without wisdom. They learned to forge weapons but not to forge peace. They learned to read the stars but not to read their own hearts. They learned to mix potions but not to mix justice with mercy. Every piece of knowledge became a tool for personal gain, for domination, for the satisfaction of desire. Knowledge without restraint is a fire without boundaries. It consumes everything. It spreads without direction. It destroys without discrimination. The earth filled with violence, sorcery, warfare, and perversion. The teachings of the Watchers spread like disease. One city learned and taught another. One generation passed the knowledge to the next. What had been revealed in secret became common practice. The forbidden became familiar. Warriors perfected the use of Azazel's weapons. Armies marched with swords and shields, conquering territories that had no defense against such tools. The strong enslaved the weak. Kings rose and fell not by wisdom or righteousness, but by who possessed better weapons, larger forces, more brutal tactics. Sorcerers multiplied. Men and women who had learned Semjaza's arts set themselves up as intermediaries between the natural and supernatural. They claimed power over life and death. They offered services, curses for enemies, love potions for the desperate, protection charms for the fearful. They became wealthy and influential, even as they corrupted everyone who sought their help. Astrologers advised rulers. No king would make a decision without consulting the stars. No merchant would set out on a journey without checking the omens. No family would arrange a marriage without comparing celestial signs. Humanity became enslaved to the very heavens that had been given as signs of divine faithfulness. The teachings of the Watchers became tools of domination, seduction, and death. Knowledge that could have elevated became the means of degradation. Understanding that could have brought order instead brought chaos. Secrets that were meant to remain hidden until the appointed time were loosed too early, and humanity choked on them. Women used the beautification techniques Azazel taught to seduce men of power. Marriages were destroyed. Families fractured. Lust replaced love. Appearance became more valued than Charak. The surface became everything while the substance was forgotten. Men used the weapons to build empires of blood. They carved kingdoms from the flesh of their enemies. They established rule through fear. Might became right. Violence became virtue. The strong praised themselves for their strength while the weak suffered in silence. Poisoners eliminated rivals in the dark. Root-cutters sold death in vials. Enchanters clouded minds and manipulated wills. The social fabric that held communities together began to unravel. No one could trust anyone. Every meal might be poisoned. Every friend might be a sorcerer in disguise. Every smile might hide a curse. We see knowledge itself become a weapon, not knowledge in service of truth, not knowledge seeking understanding, but knowledge divorced from wisdom, untethered from righteousness, unleashed without restraint. The Watchers had given humanity the equivalent of fire to children, and the children were burning down the world. Humanity, unprepared, wielded it toward ruin. They did not have the maturity to handle what they had been given. They lacked the ethical framework to use such power responsibly. They possessed the means to do great harm without understanding why they should refrain. The appointed time for these revelations had not come. Perhaps in a future age, when humanity had grown in wisdom and character, such knowledge could have been safely revealed. Perhaps after generations of learning restraint, of practicing justice, of submitting to divine order, they would have been ready. But the Watchers did not wait. They gave forbidden knowledge to a humanity still in its infancy, still learning the most basic lessons of living in a fallen world, still struggling with the fundamentals of right and wrong. The result was catastrophic. The world before the Watchers descended had been difficult, marked by sin, yes, touched by death and suffering, but there had been order of a kind, natural limits, boundaries that constrained evil even if they could not eliminate it. Violence existed, but it was inefficient. Conflict arose, but weapons were crude. Deception happened, but tools for manipulation were limited. The Watchers removed those limits. They provided efficient methods for every form of wickedness. They gave humanity the means to perfect their sin, to refine their rebellion, to accelerate their slide toward destruction. Heaven had kept these secrets for a reason, not to hoard knowledge jealously, not to maintain power arbitrarily, but because the timing mattered, because readiness mattered, because wisdom must accompany knowledge or knowledge becomes poison. The Watchers revealed what should have remained hidden. They spoke what should have remained silent. They taught what humanity was not prepared to learn, and in doing so, they ensured that the world would have to be washed clean. That judgment would have to come, that the flood would be not merely punishment but necessity. The corruption was too deep, the knowledge too widespread, the damage too severe. There was no way to undo what had been taught, no way to make humanity forget, no way to restore the innocence that had been stolen. The forbidden teachings had done their work. The secrets heaven never intended to share had been shared, and the world was drowning, not yet in water, but in blood, in sorcery, in violence, in perversion. The Watchers had given humanity knowledge, but in giving it, they had cursed the very ones they claimed to love. They had empowered the very ones they claimed to help. They had destroyed the world they claimed to enlighten. And the teachings remained, passed down, preserved, practiced. Long after the Watchers were bound, their lessons continued. Long after the flood washed away the Nephilim, the knowledge survived. A legacy of rebellion, a testament to what happens when heaven's secrets fall into unprepared hands. The forbidden had been revealed, and creation groaned under the weight of it. The offspring of the Watchers grew. From the moment of their birth, they were different, larger, stronger, wrong in ways that defied explanation. The mothers who bore them understood immediately that these were not normal children. Some died bringing them into the world, their bodies unable to sustain the trauma. Others survived but lived the rest of their days in fear of what they had birthed. The infants grew at unnatural rates. What should have taken years took months. A child who was nursing one season was walking the next. By the time ordinary children were learning to speak, the offspring of the Watchers were already taller than grown men. By the time they reached what should have been adolescence, they towered over everyone. They towered over ordinary men, beings of enormous stature and unnatural strength. Some accounts said they reached 300 cubits, over 400 feet tall. Whether this was literal height or symbolic of their overwhelming power, the reality was the same. They were giants, massive beyond comprehension, strong beyond resistance. These were the Nephilim, the fallen ones. The name itself carried meaning: those who fall upon others, those who cause others to fall. They were predators from birth, aggressors by nature, violence incarnate. They were also called the mighty men of old, the men of renown, warriors whose names would echo through history, heroes in the myths of later generations. But they were not heroes. They were monsters. Legends born from terror rather than admiration, stories told as warnings rather than celebrations. The giants whose legends echo through every ancient culture. The Greeks remembered them and called them gigantes, the titans who warred against the gods. Other cultures preserved similar memories, beings of immense size and strength who once walked the earth, who brought destruction, who were eventually defeated or buried. The details varied, but the core remained. Giants existed, and they were terrible. The Nephilim consumed everything. Their appetites were insatiable. From childhood, they ate more than entire families. As they grew, their hunger grew with them. They devoured the food of humanity until there was nothing left. Farmers brought in harvests only to watch the giants consume it all in days. Herds were slaughtered to feed them, leaving communities without livestock for milk, labor, or future breeding. Granaries were emptied, storehouses depleted. What should have sustained a village for months disappeared in a single feast. Humanity could not keep pace. They could not produce enough food to satisfy the giants' hunger. Every resource was strained to breaking. Fields were overplanted until the soil gave out. Animals were overbred until herds collapsed. Forests were hunted bare. Rivers were fished empty. And still the Nephilim hungered. When there was no more human food, they turned to what had been forbidden. They began to sin against birds and beasts and reptiles and fish. They ate animals raw. They consumed creatures that should never be eaten. They violated every dietary boundary that had been established, every natural limit. Then they turned on the people themselves. They devoured mankind, not as metaphor, not as exaggeration, but literally. The Nephilim began to hunt humans as prey. They ate flesh. They drank blood. What had begun as hunger became something darker, deliberate cruelty, sadistic pleasure in consuming those weaker than themselves. Violence became the order of the earth. What had once been the exception became the rule. The strong preyed on the weak without restraint. The powerful consumed the helpless without consequence. Every day brought new atrocities. Every night echoed with the screams of victims. Wherever the Nephilim walked, terror followed. Villages emptied at the sight of them approaching. Families fled into the wilderness, abandoning homes they had built with their own hands. Cities closed their gates. The walls provided little protection against beings who could simply scale them or tear them down. The giants moved through the land like locusts. They took what they wanted. They destroyed what they could not use. They left nothing behind but blood and ruins. Their laughter echoed across valleys where peaceful communities had once thrived. Their footprints scarred the earth, impressions too large to be believed. They were not merely large, they were wrong. Creatures that should not exist, born of rebellion sustained by corruption. Their very existence was a violation, a twisting of natural law, a perversion of the created order. Their bodies were human in shape but angelic in origin. They carried the strength of their fathers, the watchers who had abandoned heaven, but they also carried the mortality of their mothers, women who had never asked to bear such offspring. The combination was monstrous. They had power without the wisdom to wield it, immortal strength trapped in mortal flesh. Divine capacity bent toward demonic appetite. Their nature was corrupt from the beginning. There was no innocence in them, no capacity for good. They were born from transgression and lived for violence. Some ancient texts said their spirits were inherently evil, that from the moment of conception they were destined for wickedness. Whether this was divine judgment or natural consequence, the result was the same. The Nephilim were beyond redemption. The earth could not support them. Creation was not designed to bear such beings. The land groaned under their weight, not merely physical weight, though that was real enough, but spiritual weight, moral weight, the burden of sustaining creatures that should never have been born. Creation bent under their presence. Rivers changed course to avoid them. Crops failed in fields they passed through. Animals fled before them, sensing something fundamentally wrong. Even the weather seemed to respond. Storms grew more violent. Droughts lasted longer. The natural rhythms that had sustained life since Eden began to break down. The land groaned. It cried out under the oppression. The soil itself became a witness against the Nephilim and their fathers. The blood of the innocent soaked into the ground until the earth could absorb no more. It wept beneath the violence. It shuddered beneath the corruption. The skies darkened, not with natural clouds but with something heavier, a pall that hung over the world. The sun still rose and set, but its light seemed dimmer. The stars still wheeled through their courses, but they brought no comfort. Heaven itself appeared to retreat, as if unable to look upon what the earth had become. Humanity cried out, but there was no deliverer. Not yet. Prayers rose like smoke, desperate, anguished, unceasing. The righteous called on the name of the Lord. The oppressed begged for rescue. The dying pleaded for mercy. But heaven seemed silent. The Most High did not answer. The angels who had remained faithful did not intervene. The gates of paradise did not open to release salvation. Not yet. The Nephilim established kingdoms. They were not content to wander as predators. They built, they organized, they ruled. Their strength made them natural tyrants. Who could resist them? Who could challenge their authority? They declared themselves kings, and humanity had no choice but to submit or die. They enslaved nations. Entire peoples fell under their dominion. Cities that had governed themselves for generations became tributaries to giant overlords. The Nephilim demanded tribute, food, wealth, labor, human sacrifice. Communities were bled dry supporting the appetites of their monstrous rulers. Some giants warred against others, establishing territories through conquest. The earth became a map of giant kingdoms, each ruled by a different offspring of the Watchers. Borders were drawn in blood. Treaties were meaningless. Only strength mattered. Only violence had currency. They spread the teachings of their fathers and multiplied wickedness across every corner of the world. The Nephilim were not merely brutes. They inherited intelligence from the Watchers. They possessed knowledge that ordinary humans lacked, and they used that knowledge to deepen the corruption. They taught humanity the forbidden arts their fathers had revealed. Azazel's weapons became standard in the armies of the giants. Semjaza's enchantments were refined and expanded. The astrology Barakel had taught was twisted into darker forms of divination. Every secret the Watchers had shared, the Nephilim amplified. Under their rule, sorcery flourished. Temples were built to practice dark arts. Rituals were conducted that mimicked angelic worship but directed toward twisted purposes. Human sacrifice became common. The giants demanded blood, and humanity provided it, sometimes willingly out of fear, sometimes through capture and force. Idolatry spread like disease. The Nephilim set themselves up as gods. They demanded worship from the humans they ruled. Statues were carved in their image, massive stone monuments that towered over cities. Altars were built where offerings were made to appease their wrath. The true creator was forgotten, replaced by these monstrous offspring of rebellion. Perversion multiplied. Every form of wickedness found expression. What was natural was abandoned. What was forbidden became celebrated. The boundaries that had protected human dignity, marriage, family, the sanctity of life, were all demolished. The Nephilim lived without restraint, and humanity, under their influence, followed their example. This chapter explores the reign of the Nephilim, their violence, their dominance, and the way they embodied the consequences of angelic rebellion. They were living proof of what happens when cosmic boundaries are violated, walking testimonies to the cost of forbidden union. Their very existence screamed that something had gone terribly wrong. Every giant was evidence of the watch. Ur's sin, every act of violence was fruit from the poisoned tree of their rebellion. The Nephilim had not chosen to be born. They had not asked to exist, but they were consequences nonetheless. Judgment walking on legs, corruption given flesh and bone. We see the world drowning not in water but in blood and despair, awaiting divine intervention. The flood had not yet come, but humanity was already submerged, suffocating beneath violence, crushed beneath tyranny, bleeding out slowly under the reign of giants. There was no escape, no place to run where the Nephilim had not reached, no valley remote enough, no mountain high enough, no desert barren enough to provide sanctuary. The giants were everywhere. Their influence touched every corner of the known world. Their wickedness infected every culture. The righteous were few. Most of humanity had either been killed, enslaved, or corrupted. Those who remembered the old ways, who still called on the name of the Lord, who tried to live according to the laws written on their hearts, they were hunted, persecuted, mocked. Their faithfulness made them targets. Among them was Noah, a man righteous in his generation, though that generation was drowning in evil. He walked with God even as the world around him walked toward destruction. He remained faithful even as faithfulness became nearly extinct. He stood as a testimony that not all humanity had fallen, that the image of God, though defaced, was not completely erased. But Noah could not stop the Nephilim. He could not overthrow their kingdoms. He could not rescue the oppressed or restore justice. He could only remain faithful, only preserve his own household, only trust that the God who seemed silent was not absent, that the heaven that appeared to have abandoned the earth would remember, would act, would deliver. The giants continued their reign, year after year, generation after generation. They seemed unstoppable, invincible, eternal, as if the world would forever belong to them, as if violence would always triumph over righteousness, as if the offspring of rebellion would rule without end. But creation itself testified against them, the land that groaned, the skies that darkened, the blood that cried out from the ground. All of it was evidence, all of it was accusation, all of it reached the throne of the Most High, where justice was not forgotten, only delayed. The Nephilim had consumed the earth. They had devoured its resources, enslaved its peoples, corrupted its cultures. They had taken the world their mothers had given them and turned it into hell. They were mighty. They were terrible. They were legends. But they were not gods. They were not eternal. They were not beyond judgment. And judgment was coming. The world lay bleeding beneath the feet of giants. Humanity cried out with voices growing weaker, with hope nearly extinguished. The righteous few still prayed, though their prayers seemed to vanish into silent heavens. The earth groaned, unable to sustain such corruption any longer. The age of the Nephilim had reached its fullness. The cup of wickedness was filled to overflowing. The patience of heaven, though vast, was not infinite. And in the courts above, where the watchers had once stood faithful, where angels still served in purity, where the throne of the Most High remained unmoved by earthly chaos, there a decision was being made. The reign of the giants would end. The world they had consumed would be cleansed. The violence they had multiplied would be washed away. Not yet, but soon. The earth awaited its deliverance, and deliverance, though delayed, was certain. The earth itself could not remain silent. The violence, the bloodshed, the corruption, it all cried out. This was not metaphor, not poetic language. The Book of Watchers records a profound moment when creation became a witness, an accuser, a voice demanding justice. The very ground beneath humanity's feet became a witness against the Watchers and their offspring. The earth had absorbed too much blood, too much violence, too much defilement. It had been made to sustain life, to produce fruit, to support the flourishing of all living things. But now it was forced to drink blood, to bear the weight of corpses, to watch as everything planted in it was consumed by giants or destroyed by warfare. The soil became a testimony, every field stained with blood, every valley filled with bones, every riverbed choked with the bodies of the slain. The earth remembered what happened upon it, and it would not forget. The souls of the slain rose as prayers. Those who had been murdered, innocents killed by the Nephilim, victims of the giants' insatiable appetites, people crushed beneath the violence that filled the world. Their spirits did not simply vanish. They cried out. Their voices reached upward toward the gates of heaven. These were not curses, not demands for personal vengeance, but pleas for justice, for recognition, for someone somewhere to acknowledge what had been done to them, to see their suffering, to count their blood as precious rather than meaningless. The blood of the innocent soaked into soil that could no longer absorb such defilement. Like the blood of Abel, which had cried out from the ground after Cain murdered him, now the blood of thousands cried out. Tens of thousands. The accumulated testimony of an entire generation slaughtered by beings who should never have existed. The earth brought accusation against the lawless ones. It became an actor in the drama. It acquired a voice. It petitioned heaven using language reserved for appeals to kings and judges. The ground itself filed charges. Creation testified against those who had corrupted it. And heaven heard. 4 archangels, Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, and Uriel, stood in the courts above. These were angels who had not fallen, who had remained in their stations when the watchers descended, who had continued their service even as their brothers chose rebellion. They looked down from heaven and saw much blood being poured out upon the earth. From their vantage point, they could see the full scope of what was happening. Not just one city or one region, but the entire world. Blood flowing like rivers, violence spreading like flood waters, the earth drowning in wickedness. They saw all lawlessness being wrought upon the earth. The forbidden teachings had taken root. The Nephilim ruled through terror. Humanity had been corrupted almost beyond recognition. What the Creator had called good was now twisted beyond measure. They said one to another, "The earth made without inhabitant cries the voice of their crying up to the gates of heaven." The archangels heard what was rising from below, the testimony of creation, the pleas of the dying, the accusations of the soil, the prayers of the righteous remnant. The voice of those crying out upon the earth had reached the gates of heaven. It could no longer be ignored. The patience of the divine had been vast, allowing time for repentance, for change, for humanity to turn back from the path of destruction. But that patience had limits, and those limits had been reached. The 4 archangels stood before the Most High and reported what they had seen. Michael, the warrior prince, Gabriel, the messenger of divine will, Raphael, the healer, Uriel, the light of God, each brought testimony from their observations. Each added their voice to the cry rising from below. They described the chaos, how the watchers had descended from their holy stations and defiled themselves with the daughters of men, how they had revealed forbidden secrets, weapons of war, enchantments, astrology, sorcery, how they had produced offspring that consumed the earth and hunted humanity as prey. They described the suffering, the cities destroyed, the families torn apart, the innocent slaughtered, the righteous persecuted, the weak crushed beneath the rule of giants, the land soaked in blood until the very ground cried out for justice. They described the twisting of creation into something unrecognizable. What the Most High had called good had been warped into evil. What had been made for life was now an engine of death. The image of God in humanity was being systematically erased. Another generation or two, and nothing of the original creation would remain. The prayers of the righteous reached the throne. Among the millions who lived in that corrupted age, only a handful remained faithful. They had not bowed to the Nephilim. They had not participated in the forbidden arts. They had not forgotten the name of the Lord or abandoned the ways I had been taught. These few prayed, not occasionally, not casually, but constantly, desperately, with the urgency of those who knew they would not survive much longer without divine intervention. Their prayers joined the testimony of the earth, the accusations of spilled blood, the cries of murdered souls. Among them was Enoch, a man who walked with God who had not yet been taken up. He stood apart in his generation. While others pursued wickedness, he pursued righteousness. While others forgot the Creator, he remembered. While others abandoned prayer, he prayed without ceasing. Enoch had witnessed the descent of the Watchers. He had seen the birth of the Nephilim. He had watched as the world transformed from difficult to impossible, from fallen to utterly corrupt. And he had not remained silent. He had called out against the wickedness. He had warned of judgment. He had interceded for the righteous. His intercession became part of the record. The prayers of one man, faithful in an age of faithlessness, mattered to heaven. His voice carried weight not because he was powerful or influential, but because he walked with God, because he had not compromised, because he represented what humanity was meant to be, creatures in communion with their Creator. The earth groaned for justice, not merely the soil but all of creation, the animals who fled before the Nephilim, the plants that withered under the weight of corruption, the rivers that carried away the blood of the slain, the mountains that bore the scars of violence, all of it joined in a single desperate plea: let this end. Let righteousness be restored. Let creation be what it was meant to be. Humanity pleaded for rescue. The few who remained uncorrupted begged for deliverance. They could not save themselves. They had no strength against the giants, no wisdom to counter the forbidden teachings, no power to overthrow the kingdoms of the Nephilim. Their only hope was divine intervention, and they cried out for it with every breath. And the divine council convened. The Most High sat upon the throne, surrounded by the hosts of heaven. The archangels presented their report. The testimony of creation was heard. The prayers of the righteous were received. The accumulated evidence of wickedness was laid bare. This was not a hasty decision, not a moment of divine anger acting impulsively. This was measured, deliberate, the conclusion of long observation, the response to accumulated evidence, the answer to prayers that had been rising for generations. The council considered what had been reported. The Watchers had abandoned their posts. They had violated cosmic boundaries. They had corrupted humanity through forbidden knowledge. They had produced offspring that were destroying creation itself. The earth was filled with violence. The innocent were being slaughtered. The image of God was being erased. Something had to be done, not out of vengeance, not out of cruelty, but out of justice, out of mercy for those who suffered, out of love for creation itself which groaned under oppression. This chapter captures the turning point, when heaven could no longer watch in silence, when the cries of the oppressed and the testimony of creation itself demanded response. There comes a moment when patience transforms into action, when mercy, which has long delayed judgment, joins hands with justice to do what must be done. Heaven had not been indifferent to the suffering below. The Most High had seen every act of violence, heard every cry of the oppressed, counted every drop of innocent blood, but divine timing operates on scales beyond human comprehension. What seems like delay to mortals is often preparation in the courts of heaven. Now the preparation was complete. The evidence was overwhelming. The testimony was undeniable. The time for intervention had arrived. We see the moment before judgment, when mercy and justice prepared to act together, to cleanse what had been defiled and restore what had been broken. These were not opposing forces, mercy against justice, compassion against righteousness. They were united. Both required that the corruption end. Both demanded that the innocent be delivered. Both insisted that creation be given a chance to begin again. Mercy for those who suffered meant justice against those who caused the suffering. Compassion for the righteous remnant meant judgment upon the wicked. Love for creation meant cleansing it of what defiled it. There was no contradiction, only necessity. The decree began to take shape in the divine council. The Watchers would be bound. Their offspring would be destroyed. The earth would be washed clean. A remnant would be preserved. Creation would be given a fresh start, though it would still bear the scars of what had happened. The archangels received their commissions. Each would play a role in executing the judgment that was about to unfold. Michael would bind the leaders of the rebellion. Gabriel would stir the Nephilim against each other. Raphael would imprison Azazel. Uriel would warn Noah. But before the judgment fell, there was this moment, this pause, when heaven acknowledged what the earth had suffered, when the prayers of the righteous were received and honored, when the testimony of creation was validated, when the cry for justice was answered with the promise that justice would come. The earth had called to heaven, and heaven had responded. The souls of the slain were not forgotten. Their deaths were not meaningless. Their blood did not cry out in vain. Heaven had heard. Heaven had seen. Heaven would act. The righteous who had prayed through years of oppression, who had remained faithful when faithfulness seemed futile, who had trusted when trust seemed foolish, they would be vindicated. Not all would survive to see the world after judgment. Many would die before the flood came, but their prayers had mattered. Their faithfulness had counted. Their voices had reached the throne. Enoch, who had walked with God through the darkest age humanity had yet known, would be taken up before the flood. He would not see death. He would be translated from earth to heaven, a testimony that righteousness still mattered, that faithfulness was still recognized, that walking with God still had meaning even when the whole world walked in the opposite direction. The earth itself, which had groaned under corruption, which had absorbed blood until it could absorb no more, which had testified against the lawless ones, it would be cleansed. The flood would come. The waters would rise. The violence would be washed away. The blood would be covered. The defilement would be purged. And after the waters receded, the earth would bloom again. It would produce fruit again. It would support life again. Not perfectly. The fall of Adam still affected all creation, but freed from the specific corruption of the Nephilim, freed from the rule of giants, freed from the accumulated wickedness of that age. Heaven had heard the cry of the earth. The divine council had convened. The decision had been made. Judgment was coming, not arbitrary, not capricious, not cruel, but necessary, just, merciful in its severity. The turning point had arrived, the moment when long silence gave way to decisive action, when heaven's patience, which had endured for generations, reached its appointed end, when the prayers of the righteous and the cries of creation converged into a single, overwhelming call for intervention. And intervention was coming. The archangels prepared to execute their commissions. The watchers, still walking the earth in their stolen flesh, did not yet know their sentence had been pronounced. The Nephilim, still ruling through violence, did not yet understand their days were numbered. Humanity, still suffering under oppression, did not yet see deliverance on the horizon. But in the courts of heaven, where all futures are visible, where time bends to eternal purposes, the outcome was already certain. The reign of the giants would end. The corruption would be cleansed. The world would be made new. The earth had cried out. Heaven had heard. And the response was already in motion, descending from the throne toward the world that waited, bleeding and broken. For salvation it could not provide for itself. Justice was coming. Mercy was coming. Judgment was coming. And with them the hope of restoration. The promise that wickedness, no matter how overwhelming, would not have the final word. That creation, no matter how corrupted, was not beyond redemption. That the voice of the oppressed, no matter how weak, would reach the throne and be answered. The cry of the earth had been heard, and heaven would respond. The Most High spoke. The decree went forth. In the courts of heaven, where the testimony had been heard and the evidence weighed, the voice of eternal authority pronounced judgment, not in anger, not in haste, but with the certainty of one who sees all things, knows all things, and acts in perfect righteousness. The watchers would be bound. Their offspring would destroy one another. The earth would be washed clean. Each element of the decree addressed a specific aspect of the corruption. Each sentence targeted a particular consequence of the rebellion. Justice was precise, measured, inescapable. The archangels received their commissions. Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, Uriel, each had stood before the throne and reported what they had witnessed. Now they would execute the response, not as vengeance, not as punishment driven by emotion, but as servants carrying out divine will, restoring order to what had been thrown into chaos. Gabriel was sent to stir the Nephilim against each other, to turn their violence inward until they consumed themselves. The giants had spread violence across the earth. They had consumed humanity, drained the land, corrupted everything they touched. Now their own nature would become their destruction. The command was specific. Proceed against the bastards and the reprobates, and against the children of fornication, and destroy the children of the watchers from amongst men. Send them one against the other that they may destroy each other in battle. Gabriel's task was not to personally slay the Nephilim. That would be too merciful, too quick. Instead, he would work within their own corrupt nature. The giants had no loyalty, no brotherhood, only appetite, only the desire for dominance. Gabriel would amplify what was already there, the competition, the rivalry, the lust for power. The Nephilim would turn on one another, brother against brother, kingdom against kingdom. The same violence they had used to subjugate humanity would become the instrument of their own destruction. They would devour each other as they had devoured mankind, and in their mutual slaughter, the earth would begin to be cleansed of their presence. Michael was commanded to bind Semjaza and the leaders of the rebellion, to cast them into darkness until the day of final judgment. Semjaza, who had led the oath on Mount Hermon, who had convinced 200 watchers to abandon their posts, who had taught enchantments and corrupted humanity with forbidden knowledge. He would be the first to face divine justice. The Lord said to Michael, "Go, bind Semjaza and his associates who have united themselves with women, so as to have defiled themselves with them in all their uncleanness. And when their sons have slain one another, and they have seen the destruction of their beloved ones, bind them fast for 70 generations in the valleys of the earth, till the day of their judgment and of their consummation, till the judgment that is forever and ever is consummated." The sentence was layered. First, the watchers would watch their offspring destroy each other. They would witness the fruit of their rebellion, the children they had produced through forbidden union, tear themselves apart. Only after seeing this consequence would they be bound. 70 generations, not destroyed, not annihilated, but imprisoned, held in chains of darkness, aware, conscious, waiting. The punishment was not merely confinement, but anticipation. They would know judgment was coming. They would count the generations. They would experience the slow, inexorable approach of their final reckoning. Raphael was tasked with binding Azazel, throwing him into the desert, covering him with jagged stones, and sealing him in darkness until the great day of reckoning. Among all the watchers, Azazel had brought the most visible corruption. He had taught men to forge weapons. He had shown women how to beautify themselves for seduction. He had been the architect of much of the violence and perversion that filled the earth. His punishment would be solitary, severe, lasting. The Lord said to Raphael, "Bind Azazel hand and foot and cast him into the darkness, and make an opening in the desert which is in Dudil and cast him therein, and place upon him rough and jagged rocks and cover him with darkness, and let him abide there forever, and cover his face that he may not see light. And on the day of the great judgment he shall be cast into the fire." The imagery was stark. Azazel would be buried in a desert place called Dudil. His hands and feet would be bound so he could not escape. Rough, jagged stones would be piled upon him, not to crush him, for he was still an angelic being, but to seal him in. Darkness would cover him completely. He would see no light, experience no relief, no reprieve. This was not temporary detention. The phrase forever indicated the permanence of his imprisonment. He would remain there until the great judgment, the final day when all accounts would be settled, when the temporary punishments would give way to eternal consequences. And then he would be cast into the fire. The binding was not the final punishment. It was the holding period, the waiting room before the execution of ultimate judgment. Azazel would spend ages in darkness, knowing that fire awaited him, anticipating it, unable to escape it. The decree continued, and the whole earth has been corrupted through the works that were taught by Azazel. To him ascribe all sin. This was the verdict, the attribution of guilt. Not all sin, humanity bore responsibility for their own choices, but the corruption that flowed specifically from forbidden knowledge. The weapons, the warfare, the seduction, the perversion, all of it could be traced back to Azazel's teachings. He would bear the weight of that guilt, alone, in darkness, under stones, for ages beyond counting. Uriel was sent to warn Noah, to instruct him in the building of the ark, to preserve a remnant through the coming flood. While the other archangels dealt with judgment, Uriel carried a message of mercy. Not all humanity would perish. Not every righteous person would be swept away with the wicked. A remnant would be preserved. The Lord said to Uriel, "Go to Noah and tell him in my name, hide thyself, and reveal to him the end that is approaching, that the whole earth will be destroyed, and a deluge is about to come upon the whole earth, and will destroy all that is on it." Noah was righteous in his generation. Among all the people of the earth, he had not bowed to the Nephilim. He had not participated in the forbidden arts. He had walked with God as his great-grandfather Enoch had walked, and because of his faithfulness, he would be saved. But not without effort, not without obedience. Uriel would instruct him in what to do, instruct him that he may escape and his seed may be preserved for all the generations of the world. Noah would build an ark according to divine specifications. He would gather his family. He would bring animals to preserve the species. He would trust what seemed impossible, that water would cover the entire earth, that only those in the ark would survive. The commission to Uriel revealed the dual nature of divine judgment: severity toward the wicked, mercy toward the righteous, destruction of what was corrupt, preservation of what remained faithful. The flood would come, but not before provision was made for those who deserved to live beyond it. The sentence was absolute. The watchers would not be destroyed immediately. They would be imprisoned, held in chains of darkness, tormented by the knowledge of their coming punishment. This was perhaps more terrible than instant destruction: to be conscious, to be aware, to know that judgment was certain, to count the passing generations, to anticipate the fire. Death would have been mercy. Annihilation would have been relief. But the watchers would receive neither. They would be preserved in their fallen state, held in darkness, waiting for the day when temporary imprisonment would give way to permanent punishment. Their children would perish. The Nephilim, born of forbidden union, would not survive the judgment. Gabriel would set them against each other, and they would destroy themselves in mutual slaughter. Then the flood would come and wash away whatever remained. The giants who had terrorized humanity, who had consumed the earth, who had spread violence and corruption, they would all be gone. But their spirits would not rest. Ancient texts record that the spirits of the Nephilim became the demons that haunt the earth, restless and angry, seeking to corrupt what they could no longer physically dominate. Even in death, the consequences of the Watchers' rebellion would persist, but their power would be broken. Their reign would end. Their kingdoms would fall. Their teachings would be washed away. The forbidden knowledge, the weapons, the enchantments, the sorcery, the twisted astrology would be cleansed from the earth. The flood would destroy not only flesh, but the corrupted civilization that had been built on angelic secrets. The cities where these arts were practiced would sink beneath the waters. The temples where dark rituals were performed would be buried. The libraries where forbidden texts were kept would dissolve. Some knowledge would survive, preserved in human memory, passed down through Noah's descendants. Humanity would remember how to forge metal, how to read the stars, how to work with plants. But the specific corruptions, the ways these skills had been twisted toward wickedness, would be washed away. The earth would have a chance to start again, to relearn these things in their proper time, with proper restraint. And humanity would be given a chance to begin again. Not perfect humanity. Noah and his family still carried the fallen nature of Adam. They were righteous compared to their generation, but not sinless. The flood would not reverse the fall. It would not restore Eden, but it would remove the specific corruption of the Nephilim. It would give humanity room to breathe, to grow, to multiply without being hunted by giants or enslaved by hybrid tyrants. This chapter unpacks the divine response, not impulsive but measured. Every element of the decree had been carefully considered. The testimony had been heard. The evidence had been weighed. The sentence fit the crime. The watchers who had taught rebellion would be bound. The offspring who had spread violence would destroy each other. The earth that had groaned under corruption would be cleansed. The righteous who had remained faithful would be preserved. Not vindictive, but just. The punishment was not disproportionate. The watchers had abandoned their posts. They would be removed from active existence. They had corrupted the earth. They would witness its cleansing from their imprisonment. They had produced abominations. They would watch those abominations perish. They had spread forbidden knowledge. That knowledge would be washed away. Justice required that consequences match actions. That rebellion be met with binding. That corruption be answered with cleansing. That violence be turned back upon itself. The decree was not cruel. It was righteous. We see heaven's commitment to preserve creation even as it purges rebellion, to offer mercy even in the midst of judgment. The flood was not the end of creation. It was the beginning of a new phase. The ark was proof that destruction was not total. That mercy accompanied judgment. That even in the midst of necessary severity, provision was made for continuation. Noah represented humanity's second chance. His family carried forward the human line. His obedience demonstrated that faithfulness was still possible, still recognized, still rewarded. The animals in the ark showed that creation itself would continue. The species would be preserved. Life would return to the cleansed earth. This was the pattern of divine judgment, thorough but not total, severe but not without mercy, destroying what could not be redeemed while preserving what remained faithful. The wicked would perish, but not before the righteous were secured. The corrupt would be cleansed, but not before provision was made for new growth. The decree went forth from the throne. The archangels received their commissions and prepared to execute them. Gabriel would move among the Nephilim, stirring ancient rivalries, amplifying natural aggression, turning brother against brother. Michael would wait for the moment when the giants had destroyed themselves, then bind Semjaza and the other leaders in chains of darkness. Raphael would drag Azazel to the desert, bury him under jagged stones, seal him in darkness. Uriel would visit Noah, warn him of what was coming, instruct him in building the ark. Each angel knew his task. Each understood the purpose. Each moved to execute divine will with precision and authority. The watchers, still walking the earth in stolen flesh, did not yet know their sentence had been pronounced. They continued their corrupt existence, unaware that their time was measured in moments rather than generations. The Nephilim, still ruling through violence, did not yet understand that their mutual destruction was already set in motion. Humanity, still suffering under oppression, did not yet see that deliverance was coming. But in the courts of heaven, the decree was absolute. The judgment was certain. The execution was underway. The watchers would be bound. Their offspring would perish. The earth would be washed clean, and humanity would begin again, scarred by the memory of what had happened, but freed from the immediate corruption of giants and forbidden knowledge. Justice had spoken, mercy had provided, and the response to creation's cry was descending from heaven to earth, carried by angels who served without question, who executed without hesitation, who would restore order to what rebellion had thrown into chaos. The divine decree had been issued, and it would be fulfilled. Enoch walked with God. Among all the men of his generation, he alone remained righteous. While the world descended into violence and corruption, while the Nephilim ruled and the watchers taught forbidden knowledge, Enoch maintained his faithfulness. He did not bow to the giants. He did not participate in the forbidden arts. He kept his face turned toward heaven even when heaven seemed silent. His name meant dedicated or initiated, and he lived up to that meaning. From his youth he had been set apart, different. While others pursued the pleasures and powers offered by the fallen angels, Enoch pursued communion with the Most High. He prayed, he meditated, he observed, he recorded. And he was chosen to carry a message. The judgment had been decreed. The archangels had received their commissions. The divine response to the earth's cry was already in motion. But before it was fully executed, there would be one final exchange between heaven and the watchers. One last opportunity for the fallen angels to understand the finality of their situation. The watchers, now aware of their coming judgment, pleaded for mercy. They had heard somehow, whether through remaining connections to the heavenly realm, or through signs in creation, or through direct angelic warning, that their sentence had been pronounced. They knew the Nephilim would be destroyed. They knew they themselves would be bound, and they were afraid. Fear is a strange thing in immortal beings. They had never known death, never experienced true vulnerability. But now, for the first time, they faced consequences they could not escape, power they could not resist, authority that would not be swayed by their strength or knowledge. They turned to Enoch, asking him to intercede on their behalf, to write a petition to the Most High. It was an extraordinary request. Fallen angels who had once stood in the divine presence, who had served in the courts of heaven, who had known the glory of the eternal throne, now they were asking a mortal man to speak for them. They could not approach God themselves. They had forfeited that privilege when they descended, when they abandoned their posts, when they chose the earth over heaven. The door they had walked through closed behind them, and they could not open it again. But Enoch could. Enoch still walked with God. He still had access. He could ascend where they could not. He could speak where they would not be heard. So they came to him, these massive beings clothed in stolen flesh, humbled now by fear. They asked that I write a memorandum of petition for them, that they might have forgiveness, and to read their petition in the presence of the Lord of heaven. Enoch, faithful and obedient, agreed, not because he believed the watchers deserved mercy, not because he thought their petition would succeed, but because he was asked, because it was the right thing to do, because even the condemned deserve to have their voice heard, even if the answer is no. He sat by the waters of Dan, south of Mount Hermon, the very place where the watchers had sworn their oath. There, where rebellion had been sealed, a petition for mercy would be written. There was something profoundly sad about that, the place of their binding becoming the place of their begging. Enoch wrote carefully. He recorded their request for forgiveness, their plea for leniency, their hope, however desperate, that the sentence might be commuted. He wrote concerning their deeds and concerning their sons for whom they were making request, that they might have forgiveness and longevity. The petition was complete, the words were chosen, the appeal was ready, and Enoch ascended. He stood before the throne. The journey from earth to heaven was not physical in the ordinary sense. Enoch did not climb. He did not fly. He was taken up, lifted from the realm of mortality into the courts of the eternal. The transition was immediate and overwhelming. Enoch found himself in a place beyond description. The heavenly temple, a structure of light and glory, vast beyond comprehension. The foundations were crystal. The walls were living fire. Everything gleamed with radiance that had no earthly comparison. The very stones sang with holiness. He saw layers of heaven, outer courts where angels ministered, inner chambers where seraphim cried out without ceasing, and at the center, the throne room itself, the place where all authority resided, where all power emanated, where the Most High sat in glory that made the sun look dim. Enoch approached with trembling, not from fear of violence, there was no threat here, but from overwhelming awe, from the crushing weight of standing before infinite holiness while still clothed in finite flesh. He was mortal, fallen like all descendants of Adam, and he stood where only the pure could stand. But he had been summoned, called, permitted, and so he came forward carrying the petition of the fallen angels clutched in trembling hands. He presented the petition of the fallen angels. He read it aloud before the throne, every word the watchers had asked him to write, every plea for mercy, every hope for forgiveness. He did not edit. He did not soften. He simply delivered what he had been asked to deliver. The reading complete, Enoch waited. Silence filled the throne room, not empty silence but full silence, the kind that presses down with weight and significance. The presence of the Most High was palpable, real, more solid than stone, more certain than breath. But the response was final. There would be no pardon. The voice that had spoken creation into being now spoke judgment upon those who had corrupted it. The words were absolute, measured, without room for negotiation. Go and say to the watchers of heaven who sent you to petition in their behalf, you ought to petition for men, not men for you. The rebuke was devastating. The watchers had been created to serve humanity, to watch over them, to guard them. Instead, they had corrupted them. And now they asked humans to intercede for them. The inversion was complete. The absurdity was clear. Why have you left the high, holy, and eternal heaven and lain with women, and defiled yourselves with the daughters of men, and taken to yourselves wives, and done like the children of earth, and begotten giants as your sons? The indictment was specific. Each phrase named a transgression. Each question exposed the magnitude of their rebellion. And though you were holy, spiritual, living the eternal life, you have defiled yourselves with the blood of women, and have begotten children with the blood of flesh, and as the children of men, have lusted after flesh and blood as those also do who die and perish. They had traded the eternal for the temporary, the holy for the defiled, life that never ends for passion that cannot sustain. Therefore have I given them wives also, that they might impregnate them and beget children by them, that thus nothing might be wanting to them on earth. But you were formerly spiritual, living the eternal life, and immortal for all generations of the world. Humanity needed marriage, procreation, continuation through offspring because they died. But angels did not die. They did not need wives. They did not require children. They already possessed eternal life, and they had thrown it away. And therefore I have not appointed wives for you, for as for the spiritual ones of the heaven, in heaven is their dwelling. This was the boundary, the law, the order that had been violated. Angels belonged to heaven, humans belonged to earth. The mixing was never intended, never permitted, and now the consequences would follow. The watchers had abandoned their heavenly estate. They had corrupted the earth. They had revealed forbidden knowledge. They had produced abominations. Their punishment was sealed. No petition would change it. No plea would soften it. The decree had been made by the one whose word creates and destroys, whose judgment is always right. Enoch returned with the message. He descended from the throne room back to the earth, carrying words heavier than stone. The watchers would be bound. Their sons would fall. The earth would be cleansed. There would be no mercy for them, no reprieve, no second chance. He found the watchers waiting at Ubalsile, between Lebanon and Senir. They sat with their faces covered, mourning even before they heard the verdict. Perhaps they already knew. Perhaps something in the spiritual atmosphere had shifted. Perhaps they felt the weight of divine judgment settling upon them like chains before Michael arrived to make those chains literal. Enoch recounted to them the vision, everything he had seen, everything he had heard, the throne room, the presence, the rebuke, the final verdict. He did not soften the message. He did not offer false comfort. He simply delivered what he had been given to deliver. The watchers listened, and they understood. There would be no forgiveness. Their petition had been denied. Their rebellion would be met with binding. Their corruption would be answered with imprisonment. Their offspring would perish, and they would be held in darkness, waiting for the final judgment that was yet to come. Yet even in this, there was revelation. Enoch's ascension had not been only about delivering a message to the watchers. It had been about receiving understanding for himself. He was shown visions of the heavenly temple, of the throne room, of the structure of heaven and earth, of things past and things to come. He saw the dwelling place of the righteous, where those who remained faithful would go after death. He saw the place of punishment for the wicked. He understood that judgment was not merely temporal but eternal, that consequences extended beyond the physical realm into spiritual reality. He was shown the courses of the luminaries, the sun, the moon, the stars, not for astrology, not for divination, but for understanding. Order of creation, the precision of divine design, the way celestial bodies mark times and seasons not as fate, but as faithful testimony to the Creator's wisdom. He saw the storehouses of snow and hail, the chambers of winds, the foundations of the earth. He understood the mechanics of creation in ways no other mortal had, not forbidden knowledge but revealed knowledge, given at the right time to the right person for the right purpose. He was given understanding not granted to other mortals. Why him? Why Enoch? Because he walked with God, because he remained faithful when faithfulness seemed impossible, because he could be trusted with truth, because his heart was oriented toward righteousness rather than rebellion. This chapter follows Enoch's unique role: scribe, prophet, mediator. He wrote the petition of the fallen. He carried their message to heaven. He returned with the divine response. He witnessed what few mortals had witnessed. He understood what few could understand. And he recorded it all, preserving the account for future generations. We see his faithfulness in the midst of rebellion. Enoch did not compromise. He did not participate in the corruption around him. He did not bow to the Nephilim or learn from the watchers. He remained separate, holy, dedicated to the service of the Most High even when that service made him an outsider in his own generation. His courage before the divine throne, to stand before infinite holiness while still mortal, to carry a petition he knew would be denied, to look upon glory that could have consumed him, to receive visions that expanded his understanding beyond what human minds were meant to hold. This required courage of a rare kind, not the courage to fight, but the courage to remain faithful regardless of cost. And the weight of the message he carried back to the fallen. Enoch bore the burden of telling immortal beings that their rebellion had sealed their fate, that no petition would save them, that their children would die, that they themselves would be bound in darkness. This was not a message anyone would want to deliver, but Enoch delivered it faithfully. After delivering the judgment to the watchers, Enoch continued his life. He walked with God for 300 years. He fathered children. He lived among humanity, a witness to righteousness in an age of corruption. He preserved the knowledge he had been given, writing it down for those who would come after. And then he was taken. God took him. He did not see death. He was translated from earth to heaven, removed from the corruption before the flood came. His faithfulness was rewarded. His dedication was honored. He passed from mortality to immortality without experiencing the grave. Enoch's role was complete. He had been the bridge between heaven and earth at a crucial moment, the mediator between the fallen and the throne, the scribe who recorded what would otherwise have been forgotten, the prophet who understood the times, the righteous man who proved that faithfulness was still possible even in the darkest age. His message to the watchers was final. His visions were recorded. His life was a testimony, and his translation was proof that God did not forget the righteous, even when the righteous were few, even when the world was drowning in wickedness, even when judgment was about to fall. Enoch walked with God, and then he was not, for God took him. Between those two statements lay a life of extraordinary faithfulness, courage, and dedication, a life that mattered not only in its own time but for all generations that followed, a life that proved rebellion was not inevitable, that corruption could be resisted, that walking with God was still the highest calling any mortal could pursue. The watchers received their answer through Enoch. Judgment was coming, and nothing would stop it. The rains began. After years of Noah's labor, after the ark was completed and the animals gathered, after the righteous were secured inside, the heavens opened. The fountains of the deep broke open. Water that had been held beneath the earth's surface erupted upward. Springs became geysers. Rivers became torrents. The ground itself seemed to vomit water. The windows of heaven poured forth. Rain fell unlike any rain before or since. Not scattered showers, not gentle storms, but sheets of water, walls of water, as if the sky itself had become ocean and was collapsing onto the earth. Day and night, without pause, the water fell. The flood rose, covering the mountains, drowning the Nephilim, washing away the cities of violence. The waters climbed higher than anyone thought possible, 15 cubits above the highest peaks. The giants who had seemed invincible, who had ruled through strength and terror, found themselves helpless. They could not outrun the water. They could not climb high enough. They could not fight what could not be struck. The Nephilim drowned. One by one, then in groups, the offspring of the watchers perished beneath the rising waters. Their great strength meant nothing. Their size became liability rather than advantage, more mass requiring more air, sinking faster in the depths. They gasped. They struggled. They died. All flesh that moved on the earth perished. Birds and cattle and beasts and every swarming thing. The corruption had spread so thoroughly that the earth itself needed cleansing. Animals that had been twisted by proximity to the Nephilim. Creatures that had been taught to behave unnaturally. All of it was washed away. And all mankind. Entire civilizations disappeared beneath the flood, cities built over generations, temples constructed to honor false gods, markets where forbidden knowledge had been bought and sold, homes where families had lived in terror of the giants. All of it sank beneath the water, dissolved, erased. Humanity perished, save for Noah and his family, preserved in the ark according to divine instruction. 8 people survived: Noah and his wife, his 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and their wives. 8 righteous souls kept safe while the world outside drowned in judgment. The ark floated on waters that covered the earth. Inside, the family listened to the rain pounding against the wooden hull. They heard the muffled sounds of destruction outside, the crashing of structures, the roaring of waters, the fading cries of those who had not entered when the door was still open. They waited, trusting that the God who had commanded them to build would preserve them through the catastrophe. But the flood was not only physical, it was spiritual. While the waters rose on earth, Judgment fell in the heavenly realms. The Watchers, who had walked the earth in stolen flesh, who had ruled through their offspring, who had corrupted humanity with forbidden teachings, their time had come. As the waters rose, the Watchers were bound. The decree had been pronounced. The sentence had been delivered through Enoch. Now it was executed. Michael and the other archangels moved with divine authority to carry out what had been commanded. Chains of darkness wrapped around them. Not physical chains, these were beings of spirit, even clothed in flesh. But spiritual bonds stronger than any metal. Chains forged from divine judgment. Restraints that could hold immortal beings. Darkness that was not merely absence of light but presence of divine wrath. They were cast into the abyss, into Tartarus, into pits of gloom where they would remain until the day of final judgment. Tartarus, a place beneath the earth, beneath the seas, beneath even the realm of the dead. A prison specifically designed for rebellious angels. A holding place where they would wait, conscious and aware, for ages beyond counting. The text speaks of them being bound in pits of darkness, deep places, isolated places, where no light penetrated, where no comfort existed, where time stretched endlessly with nothing to mark its passage except the weight of guilt and the certainty of coming punishment. Their power was stripped. The Watchers had been formidable. They possessed knowledge of celestial mysteries. They carried residual glory from their time in heaven. They had taught secrets and produced offspring that terrorized the earth. But now all of that was taken away. They were reduced to prisoners, helpless, bound, unable to exercise any influence. Their influence severed. They could no longer teach, no longer corrupt, no longer produce offspring. The connection between them and the earth was cut completely. Whatever damage they had done remained preserved in human memory and practice, but they could do no more. Their active rebellion was finished. The earth was cleansed, but they were not destroyed, only imprisoned, held in torment, awaiting the end of all things. This was perhaps worse than annihilation. To continue existing in such conditions, to remain conscious through ages of darkness, to know that this was not the final punishment but only the waiting room before it. They could not die. Angels do not experience death as mortals do. They could not escape. The chains held them absolutely. They could not repent. The time for that had passed. They could only wait and remember and anticipate the fire that would come. Azazel was buried in the desert under stones, his teachings erased, his name a warning. Raphael executed this portion of the decree personally. He bound Azazel hand and foot. He opened a pit in Dudil, a desert place. He cast the fallen angel into it. He covered him with rough and jagged stones. He sealed him in darkness. Azazel, who had taught men to forge weapons of war, who had shown women how to beautify themselves for seduction, who had been credited with much of the corruption that filled the earth. Now he lay buried, alone, crushed beneath stone, unable to see light, unable to move, waiting for the day of great judgment when he would be cast into fire. The other leaders suffered similar fates. Semjaza, who had led the oath on Mount Hermon, was bound with his associates. They were cast into valleys of the earth, held there for 70 generations until the time appointed for their final judgment. Each leader of the rebellion received his portion of the sentence. Each was imprisoned according to divine decree. Their rebellion ended not in glory, but in chains. They had descended believing they could possess what they wanted, believing their power and knowledge made them above consequences, believing they could violate cosmic boundaries without judgment. They were wrong, and now they experienced the weight of that error in darkness that had no end. The flood receded. After 150 days, the waters began to decrease. The ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat. The tops of mountains became visible. Noah sent out a raven, then a dove. Eventually, the dove returned with an olive leaf, sign that vegetation was returning, that life was beginning again. The earth dried. The ground that had been covered with water for months slowly emerged. The mud hardened. The sun warmed the soil. The spring stopped flowing. The rain ceased. The world that had been underwater became land again. But it was different, not the same earth that had existed before. The topography had changed. Mountains had risen or fallen. Valleys had been carved by rushing water. The familiar landmarks were gone. This was the same planet but transformed, scarred by judgment, marked by cleansing. A new beginning emerged. Noah opened the door of the ark. He stepped out onto earth that had been washed clean. His family followed. Then the animals, pairs, and groups moving out into a world empty of the corruption that had filled it before. They spread across the land. They would multiply. They would fill the earth again. Noah built an altar. His first act on the cleansed earth was worship. He took clean animals and offered burnt offerings to the Lord. The smoke rose toward heaven, a sweet aroma, the text says, a testimony of gratitude, of faithfulness rewarded, of new beginning offered through mercy in the midst of judgment. God made a covenant. Never again would the earth be destroyed by flood. The rainbow became a sign, a promise visible in the sky whenever rain clouds gathered, a reminder that judgment had come but would not come in that form again, that humanity would be given time, space, opportunity to grow, to multiply, to choose righteousness. But the memory of the watchers remained, preserved in texts like this one. The Book of Watchers was written to ensure that future generations would know what had happened, why the flood came, what led to such catastrophic judgment, the role of the fallen angels, the corruption of the Nephilim, the cry of the earth, the response of heaven. A warning to all generations of the cost of rebellion. The story was not merely historical, it was instructional. It taught that boundaries matter, that cosmic order exists for a reason, that violating the structure of creation brings consequences. That rebellion, no matter how powerful, will be answered with judgment. The danger of forbidden knowledge, Azazel's weapons, Semjaza's enchantments, the astrology taught by Barakal and others, all of it had seemed like enlightenment at first, like advancement, like humanity gaining power and understanding, but it had been poison, knowledge given too early, secrets revealed before wisdom could guide their use, and the result had been catastrophe. And the certainty of divine justice. The Watchers had seemed invincible. The Nephilim had ruled without challenge. The corruption had spread until it seemed permanent, but justice came, not immediately, not impulsively, but certainly, measured, complete. Heaven had heard the cry of the earth, and heaven had responded. The flood was both ending and beginning. It ended the age of the Nephilim, the reign of giants, the corruption that had nearly destroyed humanity entirely. It washed away cities built on violence. It drowned offspring that should never have been born. It cleansed the earth of specific corruption that had made life unbearable. But it also began something new, the age after the flood, when humanity would spread across the earth again, when they would build new cities, plant new fields, establish new nations. They would still be fallen. The descendants of Adam carried that nature forward, but they would be free from the particular oppression of the Nephilim, free from the direct rule of giants, given another chance. The Watchers remained imprisoned, Azazel under stones in the desert, Semjaza and the leaders in valleys of darkness, the rest scattered in pits of gloom beneath the earth. They experienced the torment of their situation, bound, powerless, waiting. They could not influence the new age beginning above them, could not corrupt the fresh start humanity had been given, could not produce more offspring or teach more forbidden secrets. Their rebellion was finished, but its memory endured, written in texts preserved through centuries, told in stories passed from generation to generation, remembered in myths and legends across cultures. The giants, the flood, the angels who fell, the judgment that came. Humanity emerged into a world transformed. Noah's family became the ancestors of all people who came after. They carried forward the memory of what had happened. They taught their children about the flood, about the ark, about the judgment, about the need for righteousness even when wickedness seemed overwhelming. The earth bloomed again. Plants grew from seeds that had survived. Trees sprouted. Fields became green. The promise was fulfilled. Seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter would not cease. Creation continued. Life persisted. The world that had been cleansed was given opportunity to flourish. But underneath, in darkness that knew no dawn, the watchers waited, counting time they could not see, anticipating judgment they could not escape, serving as eternal warning of what happens when heaven's boundaries are violated, when desire overcomes duty, when power is used to corrupt rather than protect. The waters rose and the angels fell. Physical flood and spiritual binding occurred together. Earth was cleansed and heaven's justice was executed simultaneously. The age of the Nephilim ended. The imprisonment of the watchers began. And humanity was given another chance, scarred by memory, warned by history, but alive and free to begin again. The Book of Watchers preserved all of this, not as myth, not as legend, but as testimony, as warning, as reminder that rebellion always has cost, that judgment always comes, that mercy accompanies justice even in severity, that God does not abandon creation even when creation abandons God. The flood receded, the earth dried, the ark emptied, Noah planted a vineyard, life continued, but the memory remained. And the watchers, bound in darkness, served as eternal witnesses to the price of choosing earth over eternity, of trading the immortal for the mortal, of violating the boundaries that separate heaven from earth. The Book of Watchers could have been lost. Other texts vanished, burned, forgotten. Entire libraries of ancient wisdom disappeared through war, persecution, neglect. Scrolls turned to dust. Tablets crumbled. Knowledge that had taken generations to accumulate was erased in moments. Yet this one survived, hidden in caves near the Dead Sea, preserved in jars sealed against time and elements. Fragments found in Cave 4 at Qumran, written in Aramaic, dating to 200–150 BCE. Multiple copies, suggesting the text was valued, studied, copied with care by ancient scribes who understood its importance. Copied by ancient scribes, not once but many times, translated from Aramaic into Greek, from Greek into Ethiopic. Each translation was an act of preservation. Each copy was a declaration that this story mattered, that it needed to endure, that future generations would need to know what had happened and why. Guarded through centuries of silence, when the text was not accepted into certain biblical canons, it was not destroyed. It was preserved by communities who recognized its value. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church maintained it as scripture. Jewish communities preserved fragments. Scholars studied it even when it was not widely available. Why? Because the story it tells is not merely historical, it is perpetual. The events happened in the past. The flood came. The watchers were bound. The Nephilim perished, but the pattern remains. The temptations endure. The warnings still apply. The warning is timeless. Every generation faces the same fundamental choices. Will boundaries be respected or violated? Will knowledge be pursued with wisdom or reckless ambition? Will power be used to serve or to dominate? Will desire be restrained or allowed to consume all restraints? Humanity still seeks forbidden knowledge. The specific secrets may change, not weapons of bronze but weapons of mass destruction, not root cutting but genetic manipulation, not celestial divination but artificial intelligence. But the impulse remains the same. The desire to possess what is not yet meant to be possessed, to know what is not yet meant to be known, to control what should not yet be controlled. Power still corrupts. Those who gain advantage over others still use it to dominate rather than serve. The strong still prey on the weak. Knowledge still becomes tool for manipulation. Beauty still becomes weapon for seduction. The forms change. The technology advances, but human nature remains fallen, and power in fallen hands leads to the same corruptions the Watchers introduced. Boundaries still tempt. The line between what is permitted and what is forbidden still beckons. The restriction still feels like oppression rather than protection. The temptation to cross over to see what happens, to test whether consequences really follow, all of this remains. Every generation faces its own boundaries, its own prohibitions, its own temptations to rebel. And the consequences of crossing divine order remain. Rebellion still leads to judgment. Corruption still demands cleansing. Violation of cosmic boundaries still unleashes chaos. The timing may be different, the forms may vary, but the pattern holds. What was true in the age before the flood is true in every age. The Book of Watchers was preserved because every generation needs to remember what happens when heaven and earth are forced into union they were never meant to have. When the separation between realms is violated, when immortal beings seek mortal experiences, when humans grasp at divine knowledge, when boundaries meant to protect are torn down in the name of freedom or progress or desire. When immortals choose the mortal, the Watchers abandoned eternity for temporary pleasure. They traded endless existence in divine presence for brief experience of flesh. They gave up their place in heaven for passion that could not last, and they lost everything. Every generation faces similar choices, not between heaven and earth in literal terms, but between the eternal and the temporal, between what lasts and what fades, between what is right and what is immediately gratifying. The temptation to trade long-term good for short-term pleasure remains constant. When secrets are stolen before their time, Azazel's weapons, Semjaz's enchantments, the astrology taught by Barakel, all of it was knowledge that perhaps would have been discovered eventually in proper time with proper wisdom to guide its use. But it was stolen, revealed prematurely, given to humanity before they were ready, and the result was catastrophe. The warning applies still. There is knowledge humanity is not yet ready to possess, technologies we lack the wisdom to use safely, powers we do not have the character to wield righteously. The impulse to pursue knowledge without restraint, to break through every boundary, to know everything immediately. This is the echo of what the Watchers taught, and it leads to the same consequences. When pride adds to fall, the Watchers believed they could violate cosmic law without consequence. They thought their knowledge and power placed them above judgment. They assumed they could do as they pleased because they were strong. Pride told them they were exceptions, that rules applied to others but not to them, that they could control what they unleashed. They were wrong, and every proud generation that has followed has been equally wrong. Pride still precedes destruction. Arrogance still leads to catastrophe. The belief that we are above consequences, that we can manage what we cannot control, that our wisdom matches our power, this is the lie that the Watchers believed. And it is the lie every generation must resist. It reminds us that rebellion always has a cost, not immediately perhaps, not obviously at first, but certainly, inevitably. The Watchers rebelled and were bound. The Nephilim corrupted and were drowned. Humanity participated in wickedness and perished, save for the few who remained faithful. The cost of rebellion is not arbitrary. It is natural consequence. Cosmic law operates like physical law. Violate gravity and you fall. Violate divine order and chaos results. The universe is structured. Boundaries exist for reasons, and crossing them brings destruction not because God is vindictive, but because creation cannot function when its fundamental order is violated. That judgment is real, not merely metaphorical, not only spiritual, but actual, concrete, unavoidable. The flood came. The watchers were bound. The Nephilim died. Judgment fell. And the text preserves this reality so that future generations will not deceive themselves into thinking rebellion is safe, that consequences can be avoided, that judgment is myth. That mercy is offered but justice cannot be avoided. Noah and his family were saved. The righteous remnant was preserved. Enoch was taken up before the flood came. Mercy operated alongside judgment. Grace provided escape for those who remained faithful, but mercy did not eliminate justice. The wicked still perished. The watchers were still bound. Corruption was still cleansed. This balance endures. Every generation receives both warning and promise. Judgment will come for rebellion, but mercy is available for faithfulness. The door of the ark stands open until the moment it closes. Grace operates until the moment judgment falls. Both are real. Both are certain. And it points forward to a final day when the watchers will be loosed for a brief moment, when the earth will face trials again, and when the ultimate judgment will come. The binding of the watchers was not the final chapter. They were imprisoned for 70 generations until the day of great judgment. That day still lies ahead. Scripture speaks of a time when bound spirits will be released, when ancient evils will have one last moment, when the earth will face trials that echo the age before the flood. The details are veiled. The timing is hidden, but the promise is clear. What was bound will be loosed. What was imprisoned will be released, and there will be a final reckoning. This chapter closes the journey gently, reflecting on the preservation of the text, the lessons it carries, and the hope embedded even in stories of fall and flood. The Book of Watchers is not ultimately a story of despair. Yes, it records rebellion. Yes, it chronicles corruption. Yes, it describes judgment. But beneath all of that runs a deeper current, hope. That redemption is possible. Noah found grace. Enoch walked with God and was taken up. Even in the darkest age, righteousness was possible. Faithfulness was recognized. Those who remained true were preserved. The flood was not merely destruction. It was cleansing that made new beginning possible. Every generation needs this hope, that no matter how dark the age, faithfulness still matters. That righteousness is still possible even when wickedness seems overwhelming. That individuals can choose differently than their generation. That walking with God remains an option even when everyone else walks away. That creation endures. The flood covered everything. The earth was submerged, cities were destroyed, civilizations vanished, but creation itself survived. The ark preserved representatives of every species. When the waters receded, life returned. Plants grew. Animals multiplied. Humanity spread across the earth again. This is profound hope. That creation is resilient. That life persists. That even catastrophic judgment does not mean total annihilation. That God's commitment to what was made in love is stronger than the corruption that requires cleansing. The world continues. The sun still rises. Seasons still turn. Creation endures. And that the divine never abandons what was made in love. This is perhaps the deepest message. God could have destroyed everything and started over, could have unmade humanity after Adam fell, could have abandoned creation after the watchers corrupted it, but the divine did not. Instead, judgment was measured to preserve a remnant. Cleansing was severe enough to remove corruption, but not so total that nothing remained. Noah was warned. The ark was designed. Animals were gathered. The righteous were saved. Because what God creates, God does not abandon. The Book of Watchers was preserved to carry all of this forward, to warn against rebellion, to remind of judgment, to testify to mercy, to point toward final reckoning, to offer hope that faithfulness matters, that righteousness is possible, that redemption exists even in fallen worlds. The text survived in caves near the Dead Sea, copied by scribes who understood its value, translated into languages that would carry it to new cultures, preserved through centuries when it was not widely known, and discovered again in modern times, emerging from hiding to speak to a new generation. Why? Because the story still matters, the warning still applies, the hope still sustains. Humanity still stands at the same crossroads the Watchers faced. Will boundaries be respected or violated? Will power be used righteously or corruptly? Will knowledge be pursued with wisdom or reckless ambition? The Book of Watchers does not answer these questions for us. It only reminds us that the questions matter, that choices have consequences, that rebellion leads somewhere, that faithfulness leads somewhere different, that judgment is real but so is mercy, that corruption can overwhelm but redemption remains possible. The journey through this ancient text has taken us from heaven to earth, from rebellion to judgment, from corruption to cleansing. We have witnessed angels fall and giants rise. We have heard the earth cry out and heaven respond. We have seen the flood cover mountains and the ark preserve life. We have watched the Watchers bound and Enoch taken up. And now we rest in this final reflection, that the story was preserved because we need it. Every generation needs it. The warning that echoes through time. The reminder that boundaries protect rather than restrict. The testimony that judgment follows rebellion as surely as harvest follows planting. The promise that mercy accompanies justice, that redemption is possible, that God does not abandon what was made in love. The Book of Watchers endures, hidden for centuries now revealed, written in ancient languages now translated, studied by few now available to many. The story it tells is old, but the truths it carries are timeless. Rebellion still has cost, knowledge still requires wisdom, power still corrupts without righteousness, boundaries still protect, judgment still comes, mercy still offers escape, and creation still endures, sustained by the love that spoke it into being and refuses to let it go. The Watchers fell, but humanity was given another chance. The flood came, but the ark preserved life. Judgment fell, but mercy provided escape. The story could have ended in total destruction, but it ended in new beginning. And that is why it was preserved, not to terrify but to warn, not to condemn but to offer hope, not to declare that all is lost but to testify that faithfulness matters, that righteousness is possible, that even in ages of corruption, walking with God remains the highest calling any mortal can pursue. The warning echoes through time, and so does the hope. The Book of Watchers speaks to every generation, and every generation that listens finds the same truth. Rebellion leads to binding, but faithfulness leads to life. Corruption demands cleansing, but the righteous are preserved. Judgment is certain, but so is grace. The text was hidden. Now it is revealed. The story was ancient. Now it speaks anew. The warning was given once, but it echoes still. And those who have ears to hear will understand.